Hey everyone! Tonight we're stepping back into the quiet, gritty world of medieval village life. Not the kings or castles, but what it truly felt like to wake up in a small, humble village centuries ago. Forget modern comforts. Mornings were raw, cold, and shaped by survival itself. So, before we dive in, go ahead and like the video if you're ready for an honest glimpse into the past, and don't forget to subscribe. Only if you love this deep history vibe. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is. It's amazing to connect with you all across the globe. Now, get cozy, maybe lower the lights, and let's travel back together to that first breath of dawn in a medieval village. The rooster that woke the entire street. Before the invention of mechanical clocks, time was something people sensed rather than measured precisely. In the small villages and towns scattered across the medieval and early modern world, life was intimately tied to the natural rhythms of day and night. Without artificial instruments marking the passing hours, the crowing of a rooster became the village's living, breathing clock. This humble bird, perched on a rooftop or atop a fence, played a crucial role in awakening entire communities, its sharp call echoing through wooden homes, narrow streets, and sprawling fields, signaling the arrival of dawn with a sound both natural and profound. The rooster's crow was not just a simple morning noise. It was a vital social instrument that synchronized daily activities in an era when human life was governed by daylight. Before sunrise, the village was cloaked in darkness and silence. But as the first light touched the sky, the rooster would launch into its distinctive cry. This sound carried far and wide, penetrating the quiet walls of homes and cottages, stirring people from their slumber. The rooster's call was a cue for farmers to rise and tend their fields, for bakers to prepare bread, for merchants to open stalls, and for children to begin their day of learning or chores. Historically, the relationship between humans and roosters dates back thousands of years. Domestication of the red jungle fowl, the ancestor of the modern rooster, began in Southeast Asia around 8,000 years ago. From there, roosters spread across continents, becoming a staple in agricultural and rural life. By the Middle Ages in Europe, roosters were ubiquitous. Their role as natural alarm clocks was not merely a coincidence, but an essential adaptation to a world without artificial timekeeping devices. People relied on auditory cues from their environment, rooster crows, church bells, and the sun's position, to organize their lives. The architecture of villages and towns also played a role in amplifying the rooster's wake-up call. Homes were often built closely together with wooden or thatched walls, and narrow streets acted as natural sound corridors. A single rooster's crow could travel through these passages, reverberating off walls and fences, creating a chorus effect that made it seem as if many roosters were calling at once. This natural acoustic amplification ensured that even those living on the far edges of the village could hear the signal to start their day. Moreover, the rooster held a special place in cultural and symbolic life beyond its practical role. Across many civilizations, roosters symbolized vigilance, courage, and the triumph of light over darkness. In medieval European folklore and religious iconography, the rooster often appeared as a herald of the dawn and a protector against evil spirits lurking in the night. This symbolic weight reinforced the rooster's importance in daily life, elevating it from a mere farm animal to a trusted guardian of time and order. Interestingly, the reliance on the rooster as a natural alarm persisted even after early mechanical clocks were introduced in some places. Clock technology was expensive and initially limited to wealthier urban centers or churches. For the majority of rural populations, roosters remained the most reliable and affordable method to keep time. The rooster's crow was free, automatic, and perfectly synchronized with the natural cycle of light and darkness. The biological mechanism behind a rooster's crow is fascinating and tied to its internal circadian rhythm. Unlike many animals, roosters do not crow only at sunrise. They can crow before dawn and at irregular intervals during the day. However, the pre-dawn crowing is most prominent and has the strongest cultural association with waking people up. This early crow is thought to be linked to the bird's sensitivity to changes in light intensity and an internal biological clock that anticipates dawn. In villages, this meant that the rooster's crow was not a random noise, but a predictable, dependable signal for the community. This ancient tradition of the rooster's crow shaping human activity illustrates how intimately connected people once were with the natural world. In a time before alarms, smartphones, or even pocket watches, the everyday experience of waking up was an organic, communal event orchestrated by nature itself. The crow of a single rooster could command the attention of an entire street or village, uniting disparate households in a shared rhythm and purpose. We can also reflect on how this relationship between humans and roosters serves as a metaphor for our evolving relationship with time. In the modern age, time is measured in fractions of seconds by digital devices, abstracted and detached from the natural environment. Yet, centuries ago, time was alive and audible. It breathed through the morning crow of a bird. The rooster was not just a creature of nature, but a living instrument that punctuated the day, weaving human life seamlessly into the patterns of the earth. The story of the rooster that woke the entire street is a powerful reminder of how human societies have historically synchronized their lives, not with cold machines, but with the rhythms of the living world. This deep connection fostered a sense of community and shared experience that is often lost in today's disconnected, technology-driven world. As we listen to the memory of that lone crow echoing through ancient streets, we hear not just a bird, but a heartbeat of human history. A call that once roused entire villages to life, binding them together through the simple yet profound power of sound and time. In understanding this, we gain insight into the profound ways simple natural phenomena have shaped human civilization. How a rooster's call carried the weight of a new day, hope, and the promise of life resuming. This humble bird was, for many generations, the guardian of time, the keeper of routine, and the herald of morning, an enduring symbol of nature's role in the tapestry of human existence. The cold floor that shocked you awake. Waking up barefoot in a medieval home was nothing like the gentle rousing many experience today. Imagine the instant shock as your feet touch a cold, hard floor made either of packed earth or rough stone slabs chilled through by the night's lingering frost. This was the reality for countless people for centuries, long before the comfort of central heating, insulated flooring, or even thick rugs that we take for granted. The cold floor was a silent, relentless force, a harsh reminder of the fragility and rawness of daily life in a world ruled by nature's unforgiving cycles. In most medieval homes, especially in northern and temperate climates, warmth was a precious commodity, fiercely guarded. Unlike modern houses designed to trap and circulate heat, these homes were often drafty, with gaps in wooden walls, simple thatched roofs, and few sources of insulation. The dominant heating source was the hearth, a fire pit or stone fireplace, used for cooking and providing a small circle of warmth. Yet the reach of that fire's heat was limited. It rarely extended far beyond the immediate vicinity, and certainly did not warm floors or distant corners. Flooring itself was basic and utilitarian. In the simplest homes, the floor was little more than compacted dirt, hard-packed earth that over years became firm underfoot, but always retained the chill of the earth beneath. In wealthier households or communal buildings, floors might be paved with large stone slabs or flagstones. These stones were durable and practical, but cold to the touch, especially in the early morning hours before any fire had been kindled. Without carpets or rugs, stepping onto these surfaces barefoot was a sharp shock, bone-chilling and uncomfortable. This chill was not just physical discomfort. It shaped the rhythm of daily life and influenced health in subtle but powerful ways. Medieval people understood cold as a threat. Medical texts from the period, influenced by humoral theory, warn against exposure to cold as a cause of illness, particularly chills, colds, and more serious ailments like pneumonia. Yet, the practicalities of medieval living left many no choice but to endure it. Clothing and bedding were thick, but getting out of bed meant exposing bare skin to the cold air and floor below. Social status played a role in how people experienced this cold floor. Nobles and wealthier townsfolk might afford wooden floors covered with rushes, straw, or woven carpets, and thick blankets for their beds, softening the shock of the morning. Peasants, however, often had only the dirt floor and sparse bedding, perhaps a thin wool blanket or a patchwork of cloths. For them, waking meant a sudden confrontation with raw cold that urged quick movement to stoke the fire and dress in layered clothing. The architecture of medieval homes exacerbated the cold. Many were single-room dwellings where multiple people and sometimes animals slept together for warmth, but even that was not enough to banish the icy floors. Chimneys were a late innovation. Prior to their common use, smoke from fires escaped through thatched roofs or small openings, creating smoky, chilly interiors. The cold floor was an unyielding presence underfoot, the first and last sensation of the day. This harshness influenced daily habits and customs. People developed routines to mitigate the cold shock. It was common to sleep fully clothed, or nearly so, to reduce the exposure during waking. Some might wear slippers or socks to bed, though these were rare luxuries. The timing of waking was also dictated by necessity. Before sunrise, when temperatures were lowest, people hesitated to leave the warmth of their bedding. They waited for first light, assign to light fires, prepare warm drinks, and gather clothing layers before venturing fully into the chill. Beyond comfort, the cold floor was also a psychological trigger. The sudden sensation of cold jolted the senses awake, serving as an involuntary alarm clock before the invention of mechanical clocks or loud wake-up calls like roosters. This physical shock initiated a survival response, stimulating circulation, forcing quick movement, and focusing the mind on the practical tasks of the day. It was a rude but effective reminder of the day's demands. Health-wise, chronic exposure to cold floors and unheated spaces could lead to long-term effects. Poor circulation, stiff joints, respiratory problems, and vulnerability to infection were common. Medieval medical writers often recommended measures to keep feet and bodies warm, emphasizing layered clothing, hot baths where possible, and the use of herbs or warming spices. However, the reality of most people's lives made many such comforts inaccessible. This experience of cold floors also offers insight into the socioeconomic divides of the period. While today's modern floors are engineered for warmth and comfort, in the medieval era, the state of the floor reflected one's place in society. The cold, hard ground beneath the poor was a literal and symbolic foundation of hardship. It also underscores how intimately human beings are connected to their environment, how something as simple as the floor beneath our feet can shape our physical health, our waking rituals, and our very sense of existence. Even religious and cultural practices responded to this environment. For instance, in some regions, people removed shoes before entering certain sacred spaces, walking barefoot on cold stone floors as an act of humility and reverence despite the discomfort. This ritual use of the cold floor contrasts with the domestic experience, but further highlights how deeply embedded the sensation of cold underfoot was in medieval consciousness. As the centuries progressed, innovation slowly improved this experience. The introduction of chimneys improved smoke control and indoor air quality, making homes less chilly. The use of wooden floorboards, raised beds, woolen rugs, and more elaborate bedding provided insulation. Yet, for the majority living in rural areas or poorer conditions, the cold floor remained a daily trial well into the early modern period. In understanding this seemingly mundane detail, the cold floor that shocked one awake, we glimpse the broader texture of medieval life. It reveals a world where survival was a constant negotiation with natural elements, where the environment dictated human behavior and health in ways modern life has largely erased. It reminds us that the past was tactile, raw, and immediate, a reality felt in the soles of the feet first thing in the morning, as cold as the stone beneath. This elemental experience also connects us across time. While we may curse the discomfort of a chilly floor today, medieval people lived with it as an unchangeable fact. Their bodies and customs adapted, their lives shaped by the relentless cold that greeted them every dawn. The cold floor was not just a surface, it was a daily threshold, a silent sentinel marking the boundary between night's refuge and day's demands. So next time you rise from bed, think of those bare feet stepping onto that cold stone or dirt floor. The sudden bite of cold, a sharp awakening. It is a moment that carries centuries of human endurance, adaptation, and the unyielding dialogue between body and environment. The cold floor that shocked awake was not merely discomfort. It was the medieval morning's first truth, grounding life in a stark, elemental reality that modern comfort has largely forgotten: the smell of smoke. Before sunrise, before the sun had risen, long before the first light pierced the horizon, a familiar scent would drift through the cold, still air: the smell of smoke. It was the unmistakable aroma of peat and wood burning, signaling life stirring in the darkness. This smell was more than just smoke. It was the breath of human survival, a signal to the village or household that the day was beginning, that warmth and light were returning after the cold night. For centuries, the daily rhythm of early societies was deeply intertwined with fire. Before the advent of modern heating and lighting, fire was the source of life itself. The faint glow of embers rekindled in hearths across homes and settlements was not just a practical necessity, but a ritual of renewal. People depended on these fires to chase away the biting chill of night, to provide the first light before dawn, and to prepare meals that fueled the body for the hard day ahead. Peat, a dense, carbon-rich material formed from decomposed vegetation in bogs, was a vital fuel source, especially in regions where wood was scarce or forests were distant. The slow, smoky burn of peat fires produced a distinctive scent, one that became embedded in the collective memory of many cultures. The smell of burning peat and wood was a sensory anchor, a promise that despite the darkness and cold, life was persistent, enduring, and ready to begin anew. In many early communities, the process of rekindling fires before sunrise was not left to chance. It was a carefully observed moment, a time-honored tradition. Skilled firekeepers or household members would tend the embers or collect the right fuel before the night's cold fully took hold. In colder climates especially, the embers of a fire might be preserved through the night in clay pots or hearths designed to protect them from extinguishing. This effort ensured that the fire could be easily revived at the break of dawn, sparing the labor of starting from scratch. The smoke rising before sunrise was also a form of communication. In tight-knit villages or scattered homesteads, the visible plume of smoke told neighbors that life was waking. It was a subtle but powerful signal. The day was beginning, the hearths were alive, and the community was preparing to face the challenges of another day. For travelers or isolated dwellers, seeing the first smoke could mean a nearby home, a source of help, or a beacon of safety. This ancient daily ritual also reveals how deeply fire shaped human culture and survival strategies. In the absence of electric light, the warmth and flickering glow of fire was a source of comfort, safety, and social connection. Families and communities would gather around the hearth in the early hours, sharing stories, planning the day's work, or simply drawing strength from the heat. The smell of smoke before sunrise thus carried an emotional weight. It was the scent of home, of belonging, of endurance against the harshness of nature. Beyond the practical and social dimensions, fire had a spiritual significance in many early cultures. The rekindling of the hearth's flame before dawn was often accompanied by rituals or prayers, asking for protection, good fortune, and a successful day. The smoke itself was sometimes seen as a messenger, carrying these hopes upward into the unseen world. In this way, the simple act of lighting a fire was elevated to a sacred practice, a moment where the material and spiritual worlds intersected. Historically, the technology and techniques for managing fire evolved slowly but profoundly. Early humans first discovered how to control wildfires and keep embers alive, then learned to cultivate and transport fuel. The use of peat as fuel became especially important in parts of northern and western Europe, where dense forests were patchy or overexploited. Peat cutting and drying was a skilled labor that involved careful timing, knowledge of the landscape, and communal effort. This labor extended the use of fire beyond just wood burning, allowing settlements to survive winters and damp seasons when dry wood was unavailable. The scent of smoke before sunrise also reminds us of the environmental relationship humans had with their surroundings. The choice of fuel, wood, peat, dried dung, or charcoal, reflected the local ecology, resource availability, and cultural preferences. Burning peat produces a heavier, denser smoke than dry wood, filling the air with a rich, earthy aroma mixed with traces of tar and moss. This sensory experience was part of daily life, shaping how people understood and interacted with their environment. Moreover, the presence of smoke rising from multiple homes at dawn created a landscape of subtle signals. The geography of smoke patterns could indicate weather changes, resource scarcity, or social tensions. For example, a sudden increase in smoke might signal that more fires were lit to prepare for a harsh day, or that an emergency cooking or heating effort was underway. In some historical contexts, smoke signals were also deliberately used for communication over distances, although the simple daily smoke from hearths remained the most intimate and constant signal of human activity. Understanding this ancient practice enriches our appreciation of how humans adapted to their environments and created routines that balanced survival with social cohesion and spiritual meaning. The smell of smoke before sunrise is not just a sensory detail from the past. It is a window into a world where daily life revolved around elemental forces: fire, air, earth, and the cycles of night and day. Even as modern technology has replaced the peat fire with electric heaters and gas stoves, the primal connection to fire's smoke endures. Many rural communities still kindle morning fires for warmth and cooking, carrying forward a tradition that links us directly to our ancestors. The aroma of burning wood or peat remains a potent symbol of homecoming, safety, and the timeless rhythm of human life starting anew each day. So, next time you catch that faint whiff of smoke in the early morning air, remember it as a profound echo from the past. It is the call of the hearth, the scent of resilience and renewal, a reminder that long before clocks and alarms, fire and smoke marked the start of every human day. This enduring bond between humans and fire shaped the very course of civilization, from the simplest home fires to the complex social and technological developments that followed. The smell of smoke before sunrise is not just a historical fact. It is the story of human endurance, adaptation, and the intimate relationship with the natural world that has defined us for millennia. The church bells that ordered the day. The steady ringing of church bells was far more than a mere call to worship in medieval and early modern village life. These bells were the heartbeat of the community, marking time in a world that lacked the mechanical clocks we take for granted today. Imagine a village where the sun's position was unreliable, the weather unpredictable, and where many people were illiterate, unable to read written schedules or timepieces. In such a setting, the church bell was the primary instrument organizing daily life, serving as a divine clock that structured existence itself. Long before the rise of standardized clocks, communities relied on natural cues like dawn, dusk, and the changing seasons to orient themselves. But these markers were inconsistent. Fog, heavy clouds, and the shifting length of daylight through the year made them unreliable for precise daily scheduling. In contrast, the sound of church bells could penetrate through fog and darkness, reaching every corner of the village, ensuring everyone heard the same signal at the same moment. The origin of ringing church bells to order daily life goes back to the early Middle Ages, around the 6th to 7th centuries, when monasteries developed a regimented schedule of prayer called the Divine Office, or Liturgy of the Hours. These offices divided the day into canonical hours: matins, lauds, prime, terce, sext, none, vespers, and compline. Monks and clergy would gather to pray at these fixed times, marking spiritual discipline and rhythm. To coordinate these prayer times across monastic communities, bells were rung as audible signals. Over time, this practice extended beyond monasteries into the broader village community, where the church became the central social and spiritual institution. The bell became a vital social instrument. Morning bells called villagers out of bed, signaling the start of the workday. These were often rung at dawn or shortly thereafter. In a largely agrarian society, timing was everything. Farmers needed to begin labor at the right time to maximize daylight for sowing, tending, and harvesting. The bell's sound was a summons not just for prayer, but for work, organizing the rhythm of rural labor. Midday bells, ringing around the 6th hour, roughly noon, reminded villagers to pause for the midday prayer, known as sext, and often to break for a meal. Evening bells tolled to mark vespers, the evening prayer, signaling the winding down of daily work and the gathering of the community indoors. Night bells, or curfew bells, were rung at dusk to instruct villagers to extinguish fires and retire to safety. This was not only a spiritual directive, but also a practical safety measure, reducing the risk of accidental fires in densely built wooden villages. But bells were more than mere timekeepers. They were deeply imbued with sacred symbolism and authority. The church bell was considered a voice of God on earth, calling souls to repentance, warning of danger, or celebrating communal joy. The ringing carried a sense of order ordained by divine will, a heavenly cadence regulating human activity. Villagers would hear the bell as an expression of the sacred embedded in everyday life, binding the community to a shared spiritual and temporal order. In times of crisis, bells took on an even more urgent role. Fires, invasions, outbreaks of plague, or natural disasters were signaled by rapid or unusual ringing patterns. The distinctive sound of a fire bell would rouse villagers from sleep, summoning them to aid in extinguishing flames and preventing catastrophe. During wars or raids, bells could sound alarms, mobilizing local militias or signaling danger. These signals transcended language and literacy barriers, making them effective tools for mass communication. The technology of bell making and bell ringing was itself a remarkable craft. Bells were cast from bronze or brass in large foundries, carefully tuned to produce deep, resonant tones that could carry for miles. The size and placement of the bell tower were designed to maximize the range of the sound. The art of bell ringing developed into a skilled practice with specific patterns and rhythms called change ringing in some traditions, producing complex sequences that conveyed different messages or celebrated special occasions. The church bell's social power also extended to regulating moral behavior. For instance, bells rung at certain hours reminded villagers of times when work or social activities were forbidden by religious law. Bells could signal the start or end of the Sabbath or holy days, marking sacred time when labor ceased. The sound was a constant, audible reminder of religious and social discipline, shaping daily habits and communal norms. In villages where secular timekeeping was minimal, the church bell was the primary temporal authority. Lords and guilds might have had some influence on work hours, but the bell's call was the universally recognized signal. It transcended social class, reaching peasants, artisans, clergy, and nobility alike. The ringing synchronized diverse activities: work, worship, meals, rest, creating a collective rhythm essential for social cohesion. Over centuries, as mechanical clocks spread from monasteries to towns and cities, the church bell's role evolved, but did not disappear. Even with precise clocks, bells continued to mark hours, announce services, and punctuate important events such as weddings, funerals, and festivals. Their sound remained a familiar and reassuring presence, anchoring the passage of time in a communal auditory experience. Today, we might take digital watches and smartphone alarms for granted, but in the past, life literally moved to the sound of church bells. They ordered the day, shaped the seasons of work and rest, and wove sacred meaning into the mundane. To hear a bell ringing was to hear the pulse of the village itself, a call to duty, devotion, and community. In that ringing lay the voice of history, tradition, and faith, echoing through centuries as a timeless, divine clock that ordered the lives of countless generations. Understanding the role of church bells in ordering daily life invites us to reflect on how time itself is not merely measured but experienced, communal, and deeply tied to cultural and spiritual frameworks. The bells were a form of social technology, an early network of communication and control that shaped behavior long before modern clocks and calendars. They remind us that the passage of time and our relationship to it has always been shaped by sound, ritual, and shared meaning. So next time you hear a bell toll, imagine the millions across history who depended on that sound to wake, to work, to pray, and to live in harmony with their world. The church bells did not just mark the hours, they ordered the day, the week, and the very rhythm of life itself, ringing a sacred symphony that shaped human existence in profound and lasting ways. The farmer who slept in his work clothes. In the quiet villages of medieval Europe, life moved with a rhythm profoundly tied to the land and seasons. The people who inhabited these rural spaces led lives that might seem harsh and unyielding to us now, yet deeply purposeful and interwoven with the natural world. One striking aspect of this existence was the simplicity, and sometimes the starkness, of daily habits that governed the way they lived, rested, and prepared for the work that awaited them each day. Among these customs, one detail stands out. Most villagers, including farmers, did not own or use pajamas. Instead, they slept in their everyday work clothes, often their tunics, ready to rise and labor without delay at dawn. This practice may seem strange to modern sensibilities, where separating sleepwear from work or daywear is standard, but it reveals much about the socio-economic realities, cultural norms and practical necessities that shaped medieval peasant life. Clothing was a precious commodity, both in terms of cost and effort to acquire or maintain. Unlike today's world of mass-produced textiles and abundant wardrobes, medieval peasants had very limited clothing options. A single tunic, sometimes patched and mended many times over, might serve as both daily wear and nightwear. The absence of specialized nightwear also reflects the priorities and constraints of medieval life. For a peasant farmer, the day was long and relentless. The success of their family's survival depended on timely, often grueling work, beginning at first light and stretching into the fading dusk. There was little time or luxury for elaborate morning routines. Sleeping in the clothes they worked in meant they could awaken and start immediately, minimizing wasted moments and preserving precious energy. To understand this fully, we must consider the broader context of medieval textiles and clothing production. Textile manufacture was a laborious and costly process. Fibers such as wool and linen had to be grown, harvested, spun, dyed, and woven, all by hand and with tools far less efficient than modern machines. Peasant families often relied on what they could produce themselves or trade within their communities. Owning multiple sets of clothes was a luxury beyond reach for many. Moreover, laundering clothes was not a casual task. Without modern plumbing or detergents, washing involved hauling water from wells or streams, heating it over fire, and laborious scrubbing, sometimes with the aid of natural soaps or ash. Clothes were washed infrequently to conserve resources and avoid wear. This made the idea of having a dedicated set of garments for sleeping less practical. It was simpler and more economical to wear one tunic that served all purposes. The tunic itself was a versatile garment, usually made of wool or linen, designed to be durable and comfortable enough to wear throughout the day and night. It was loose-fitting, allowing some airflow and accommodating the body's changes during rest and activity. Peasants might have added layers or cloaks during cold seasons, but the fundamental practice of sleeping in day clothes remained. There was also a cultural dimension. Medieval society placed a strong emphasis on hard work, humility, and endurance. The notion of rest was functional, a necessary pause rather than a luxury to be adorned with special clothing or rituals. Sleeping in work clothes symbolized readiness, responsibility, and an unpretentious approach to daily life. It was a mark of the peasant's identity and connection to the land. This practice also had practical implications for hygiene and health, though by modern standards it might seem problematic. Sleeping in the same clothes worn all day could increase exposure to dirt, pests, and discomfort. Yet, the constant exposure to outdoor elements and the physical demands of labor meant that peasants were accustomed to living with less cleanliness than modern standards require. They adapted to these conditions as part of their existence. In some medieval accounts, we find references to people wearing simple linen shifts beneath their tunics, which might have served as primitive undergarments or nightshirts, but these were far from widespread among the lower classes. Most peasants simply lacked the resources for such additional garments. Their priority was warmth, durability, and economy. The absence of pajamas also affected the shape of daily life and the mental rhythms of villagers. When sleep was not marked by changing clothes or a distinct bedtime routine, the transition from wakefulness to rest and back again was more fluid, more closely tied to natural cues like daylight and darkness. This organic rhythm stood in contrast to the regimented, clock-driven schedules of modern urban life. Furthermore, sleeping in work clothes eliminated the need to store or care for extra garments. In small homes or huts, space was scarce. Every possession had to justify its presence. Clothing that served multiple functions saved precious room and simplified life's logistics. The practice also had social implications. Clothing indicated one's role and status, and a peasant wearing their tunic at night reaffirmed their identity as laborers and providers. It was a silent but constant reminder of their place in the social hierarchy and the continuous effort required to maintain it. Yet, there were exceptions. Wealthier individuals, or those living in towns, might have had the luxury of nightshirts or lighter garments to sleep in, but even then, the idea of a distinct sleepwear wardrobe was rare before later centuries. The medieval peasant's experience was shaped by necessity first and culture second. This intimate relationship with clothing and work extended to the way villagers greeted the day. There was no lingering in bed, no time wasted in changing or preparing. Upon waking, a farmer would rise directly from sleep in their tunic, step outside into the crisp morning air, and begin their tasks without hesitation. This immediacy was vital, especially during critical periods like planting or harvest seasons when every moment counted. The night, therefore, was not a retreat into a separate world of rest and relaxation, but a brief pause in the endless cycle of survival. Sleeping in work clothes embodied this truth. It was a practical solution, a cultural statement, and a reflection of the medieval mindset where labor, life, and rest were intimately bound. In our modern age, this practice might seem austere or uncomfortable. Yet, understanding it deeply offers us a window into the past. A past where time was marked by nature's cycles, where possessions were scarce and precious, and where every action was tied to the hard realities of existence. The farmer who slept in his work clothes was not just saving time or effort. He was living a life of profound connection to the earth and the community, embodying resilience, simplicity, and an unspoken dignity in the face of daily hardship. Through this lens, we glimpse a world where even the most ordinary details, like the clothes worn to bed, carry the weight of history, culture, and survival. The rats that shared your bed. Waking up in a medieval or early modern home was a far cry from the peaceful, controlled environments we know today. Instead of serene mornings, many people found themselves sharing their beds with unwelcome companions, rats. These rodents were not merely occasional visitors, but persistent cohabitants, exploiting the close quarters and humble living conditions of ordinary households. The presence of rats in homes was so common that waking to find rat droppings, or even live rats among the straw bedding, was a grim and frequent reality, revealing much about the challenges of daily life in earlier centuries. Rats have thrived alongside human settlements for thousands of years, their success tied intimately to human waste, food stores, and shelter. In medieval Europe, homes were often constructed from wood, wattle and daub, or stone, with uneven floors and gaps that provided ample entry points for rodents. The typical bed was not a modern mattress, but a pile of straw or rushes laid out on wooden frames or simply on the floor. These organic materials offered perfect hiding places and nesting sites for rats, which could move undetected through the house, especially at night when occupants were asleep. The infestation of rats in homes was more than just a nuisance. It posed significant health risks. Rats are notorious carriers of diseases, including bubonic plague, which devastated Europe in the 14th century. While fleas carried the plague bacterium, the proximity of rats to human living spaces made them unwitting accomplices in the spread of deadly epidemics. The very straw bedding people sought for warmth and comfort became a vector for contamination, making sleeping arrangements hazardous. Beyond health concerns, the psychological toll of sharing a bed or room with rats must have been immense. People lived with constant awareness that these creatures were rummaging through their belongings, stealing food, and even nibbling on clothing or skin. Historical accounts and literature from the period often mention rats as symbols of filth, decay, and misfortune, reflecting the lived reality of their pervasive presence. The rat's intrusion into personal spaces was a daily reminder of the precariousness of life and the limits of human control over their environment. Efforts to combat rat infestations were limited and largely ineffective for much of history. Sanitation standards were poor. Waste disposal was rudimentary, often consisting of dumping refuse in streets or yards, which only attracted more vermin. Homes lacked modern pest control measures, and remedies ranged from superstitions and crude traps to the employment of cats and dogs as natural predators. Yet, the success of these measures varied greatly, and in many places, rats continued to thrive unchecked. This situation also reveals much about social and economic conditions of the time. Poorer households were disproportionately affected, lacking the means to improve housing or sanitation. Overcrowding, shared living quarters, and limited resources exacerbated the problem. Even wealthier homes, despite better construction, were not immune, though they often had more means to try to keep rodents at bay. The rats in the bed thus symbolize more than just an infestation. They reflect the entanglement of human life with its environment, the vulnerabilities inherent in historical living conditions, and the complex interplay of poverty, hygiene, and disease. Their presence in the most intimate of spaces, the bed, highlights the thin boundary between comfort and danger, rest and unrest. In contemplating this harsh reality, we gain deeper appreciation for the advances in public health, housing, and pest control that define modern life. The humble bed, once shared with these persistent intruders, now stands as a testament to human progress. Yet the memory of those nights disrupted by rats serves as a powerful reminder of the struggles our ancestors faced, living in a world where nature's less friendly creatures were never far away, even in sleep. This intimate intrusion by rats into human resting places offers a poignant window into past hardships and survival. It forces us to acknowledge the resilience of people who endured such conditions, adapting to a world where danger and discomfort were constant companions, and where the line between home and wild was often blurred. The rats that shared your bed were not just pests. They were unwelcome witnesses to human endurance and the daily battle to carve out safety and comfort amid the precariousness of life centuries ago. The first chore was always the animals. Before the sun's first light warmed the world, before any human had the chance to sit at a table or even think about their own needs, there was a sacred duty that demanded immediate attention: caring for the animals. In early societies, the first chore of the day was never for human comfort. It was always for the livestock that sustained the community. Children and women, often the quiet backbone of daily survival, rose before dawn to feed chickens, milk goats, or fetch water, ensuring that these creatures, vital to life, were tended to before anyone thought of themselves. This early morning ritual speaks volumes about the intimate relationship between humans and animals throughout history. Livestock was more than just property. It was food, wealth, and a cornerstone of survival. Chickens provided eggs and meat, goats gave milk and sometimes meat, and fetching water was crucial for both animals and humans in often harsh and resource-scarce environments. The care given to these animals was a form of investment, a guarantee that they would continue to provide nourishment, clothing, and labor. In many agrarian societies, children were introduced to responsibility through these daily chores. Feeding chickens, collecting eggs, or milking goats was often their first task, teaching discipline, patience, and the interconnectedness of life. This wasn't merely menial labor. It was the foundation upon which families and communities built their day, their economy, and their culture. Women's roles in these early hours were pivotal. Often the primary caretakers of small livestock, women balanced their duties by ensuring the animals were healthy and productive before attending to household needs. Their knowledge of animal behavior, nutrition, and health was crucial, passed down through generations in oral traditions and practical skills. This labor-intensive start to the day underscores how animal husbandry was intertwined with gender roles, social structure, and survival strategies. The prioritization of animals over human comfort was not just practical, it was necessary. Without tending to the livestock first, entire families risked hunger and poverty. An unfed chicken might stop laying eggs. An unmilled goat might become ill, reducing milk supply. In times before refrigeration and modern food storage, daily fresh produce from animals was essential. This created a relentless cycle where animals dictated the rhythm of life. Fetching water, often a child's responsibility, was another foundational chore. Before breakfast, many children walked long distances to wells, rivers, or springs, carrying heavy containers to provide water for drinking, cooking, cleaning, and the animals' needs. This task, physically demanding and time-consuming, highlights the stark realities of life before modern plumbing and infrastructure. It was also a critical moment of learning, as children absorbed knowledge about the natural world, seasonal changes, and community interaction during these morning journeys. The first chore being animal care also reflects the ancient understanding of interdependence. Humans relied on animals not only for sustenance, but also for social and economic stability. Livestock represented a family's wealth and status. Caring for them early and diligently was a protective measure, safeguarding this precious resource against disease, theft, or neglect. Across diverse cultures and eras, from the small farming villages of medieval Europe to pastoral societies in Africa and Asia, this early morning routine was remarkably consistent. It was a universal truth that animals came before human comfort. The ritual of rising early to feed and tend to animals was embedded deeply in the fabric of daily life, shaping work patterns, family roles, and community cooperation. Even beyond practicality, there was often a spiritual or symbolic dimension to this chore. In some cultures, feeding animals first was seen as a way to honor the cycle of life, showing respect and gratitude to the creatures who sustained human existence. This act of care before comfort connected people to the natural world and reinforced values of responsibility and stewardship. The enduring image of a child carrying a pail to the coop or a woman gently milking a goat before the household awoke remains powerful. It evokes a time when survival demanded discipline, empathy, and a profound awareness of the interconnectedness between humans and animals. These simple, repeated acts laid the foundation for agriculture, food security, and community cohesion. Today, while technology has transformed many aspects of animal husbandry and water provision, the legacy of those first morning chores remains. Understanding this daily priority offers a window into the lived experience of countless generations, reminding us how human life has always been intertwined with the care and sustenance of animals. The first chore was always the animals, not because it was easy or convenient, but because it was essential for life itself, the roaring of the communal oven. Imagine a village at dawn, where the first pale light stretches over thatched roofs and cobblestone streets. Above the rooftops, a thin plume of smoke curls into the sky, a signal recognized instantly by every household. The communal oven has been fired up, its roaring heat ready to transform raw dough into the daily bread that will sustain the village. This smoke is more than a sign of warmth. It is a call to action, a heartbeat of communal life that pulses through the village with urgency and anticipation. In medieval times, especially in rural communities, private ovens were rare and costly. Instead, villages often shared a single large stone oven, maintained by the baker or a designated keeper. This communal oven was central to the daily rhythm and social fabric of village life. Firing it up was a significant event that required fuel, skill, and timing. Once heated to the correct temperature, it became a place of transformation, not just for flour and water, but for community bonds and shared survival. The smoke rising from the oven was visible for miles, a smoky beacon that families watched for eagerly. Upon seeing it, households would scramble to prepare their dough, kneading it into loaves or flatbreads. Timing was crucial. Missing the baker's slot meant waiting for the next firing, sometimes days away, and risking going without fresh bread. For many, bread was not merely food. It was the foundation of their diet, their sustenance, their daily life. This communal baking process was deeply embedded in medieval social structures. Villagers took turns or paid fees for oven use, and the act of baking together fostered cooperation and mutual reliance. Women often took responsibility for preparing dough at home and bringing it to the oven, while the baker handled the complex task of managing the fire's temperature and baking the loaves to perfection. This interplay of private preparation and public cooking symbolized a balance between individual effort and collective necessity. The oven itself was a marvel of medieval technology, often a large, domed stone structure built to retain intense heat from burning wood or peat. It could hold dozens of loaves at once, baking them evenly in a matter of minutes to hours depending on the bread type. Maintaining the right heat required experience. Too hot, and the bread would burn. Too cool, and it wouldn't cook through. The baker's skill was essential, and his role respected within the community. As smoke billowed from the chimney, it also served a practical purpose. It dispersed the heavy, smoky air that filled the oven chamber and the surrounding area, signaling that the oven was ready. Villagers listened not only to the sight of smoke, but to the sounds of crackling fire and the warmth radiating through the village square where the oven stood. Beyond sustenance, the communal oven was a place of gathering. People exchanged news, stories, and gossip while waiting their turn. It was a social hub, a shared space that reinforced village identity and collective memory. The smell of baking bread mingled with the cool morning air, bringing comfort and a sense of normalcy amid the hardships of medieval life. This ritual of communal baking also reflects broader medieval attitudes toward resources and community. Wood and fuel were scarce and expensive. Sharing an oven was an efficient use of limited materials. The communal oven minimized fire risk by concentrating cooking fires in a single managed location rather than multiple open hearths scattered through the village. It was a practical solution born of necessity, but elevated to social importance. Missing a baking slot was a real hardship. Without fresh bread, families might have to rely on less nutritious food or stale reserves. This urgency spurred quick action once smoke appeared. Dough was rushed from homes, sometimes still sticky and warm from the final kneading, to ensure it entered the oven at the right moment. The communal oven's schedule dictated much of the village's morning pace, setting a tempo for work, prayer, and daily chores. The roaring of the communal oven, then, was more than a physical sound. It was a symbol of life's continuity amid uncertainty. It connected people across households, generations, and daily struggles. It was the sound of survival, resilience, and shared hope. The smoke in the sky was a reminder that even in the harsh conditions of medieval times, communities found ways to come together, to nourish bodies and spirits alike. Through this lens, the communal oven becomes a powerful metaphor. It illustrates how medieval society balanced individual needs with collective welfare, how technology and tradition intertwined, and how the simplest act, baking bread, carried profound meaning. Each plume of smoke told a story of hands working together, of fires carefully tended, and of bread emerging golden and fragrant as a reward for cooperation and care. So, when you picture that thin line of smoke drifting above a sleepy medieval village, think of the roaring oven beneath it. Hear the crackle of flames and the murmur of villagers preparing their dough in hurried anticipation. Feel the warmth that reached beyond the oven's stones, warming bodies, binding communities, and sustaining life in a world where every loaf was hard-earned and deeply treasured. The itching that never went away. Waking up in a medieval or early modern home often meant one very uncomfortable ritual: scratching. The incessant itching caused by lice, fleas, and bedbugs was a fact of life for nearly everyone. These tiny parasites thrived in the crowded, unsanitary living conditions common in villages, towns, and even noble households, becoming a relentless and intimate part of daily existence. To understand this enduring itch is to understand the realities of hygiene, health, and social conditions in historical societies. Lice, fleas, and bedbugs are not just minor annoyances. They were carriers of disease and a source of physical and psychological torment. Living close to humans, feeding on their blood, these pests multiplied rapidly in homes that lacked modern sanitation. The warmth of human bodies, combined with shared bedding, woolen clothes, and rarely washed fabrics, created ideal breeding grounds. Daily routines often began with the desperate search for these tiny invaders before anything else, as their bites produced intense itching, redness, and sometimes infection. The most notorious of these pests was the body louse, a tiny insect that lived in clothing seams and transferred from one host to another with ease. Lice were the vectors for deadly diseases such as typhus, which swept through populations during times of war and poverty with devastating effect. Fleas, too, were infamous for spreading the plague in the 14th century, jumping from infected rats to humans, sparking one of the deadliest pandemics in history. Bedbugs, while less deadly, caused relentless discomfort, feeding nocturnally and leaving itchy welts on exposed skin. Hygiene in historical times was limited by lack of running water, absence of soap as we know it today, and cultural taboos around bathing. Washing was often infrequent, and clothing was seldom cleaned thoroughly. Bathing was sometimes seen as unhealthy or even sinful in certain periods, reinforcing the persistence of these parasites. People combed their hair with fine-toothed combs to remove lice nits and tried various folk remedies, but none were fully effective. The itching was more than just a physical irritation. It shaped social and psychological life. People's clothing and bedding became objects of suspicion and ritual cleaning. The constant discomfort affected sleep quality and concentration during work, impairing daily productivity. The stigma associated with infestation sometimes caused shame and social exclusion, as lice and fleas were wrongly associated with filth and moral failing, even though everyone was vulnerable. The relationship between humans and their parasites was so entrenched that it influenced customs and medicine. Remedies ranged from herbal infusions and smoke treatments to the use of vinegar and even shaving hair to try to break the parasite's life cycle. Medieval medical texts include detailed instructions for delousing, showing how important the problem was to everyday health. However, without understanding the biology of these pests or access to modern sanitation, solutions were temporary at best. Interestingly, these parasites also played an unintentional role in the spread of knowledge about disease transmission. The horrific epidemics linked to lice and fleas pushed medical theorists and governments to consider quarantine measures, pest control, and hygiene reforms. Over centuries, these tiny creatures forced societies to develop early public health strategies, even if incomplete or inconsistent. In literature and art, the relentless itch of lice and fleas was sometimes used metaphorically to represent human suffering, misery, and the inescapable burdens of life. These small, persistent tormentors embodied the unseen struggles of ordinary people. Their presence serves as a reminder of the harsh realities faced by our ancestors, many of whom endured this daily battle alongside harder challenges. Today, the thought of waking up to an itching body covered in bites seems alien to most, thanks to modern hygiene, medicine, and living standards. But for centuries, this was the first reality every person faced, an irritation that demanded attention before work, prayer, or any other part of the day. The itch that never went away was a constant companion, shaping the rhythm of life and highlighting the intimate and often invisible struggles of the past. Recognizing this aspect of history deepens our empathy and understanding of daily life in earlier times. It sheds light on how human bodies, environments, and social structures interacted in ways that influenced health, behavior, and culture. The persistent itch, caused by lice, fleas, and bedbugs, was more than a nuisance. It was a pervasive force that silently ruled mornings and left an indelible mark on human history, the outhouse that froze solid in winter. In the heart of medieval village life, few things were as mundane yet as essential as dealing with nature's call. Unlike the modern comforts of indoor plumbing and heated bathrooms, medieval peasants had to rely on rudimentary facilities, often nothing more than simple pit toilets known as outhouses, or chamber pots used within the home and emptied when possible. These humble solutions were integral to daily living, yet they came with their own harsh challenges, especially in winter. Imagine a village gripped by biting cold when temperatures drop well below freezing and the earth itself hardens under a crust of ice. The outhouse, a small wooden hut perched over a pit in the ground, was a place the villagers had to visit multiple times a day, regardless of weather. In warmer months, the odors might have been tolerated or masked by the open air and sunlight. But in winter, the bitter cold caused the contents of the pit to freeze solid, transforming this essential structure into an icy, unusable chamber. This freezing was more than a simple inconvenience. It was a test of endurance and adaptability. The pit's contents, which would normally decay and seep into the soil, became a hardened mass, sealing the pit and preventing it from functioning as intended. Villagers faced a cruel dilemma. Their usual method for waste disposal was effectively shut down, forcing them to find alternatives or suffer the consequences. One common workaround was the increased use of chamber pots inside the home. These ceramic or metal vessels allowed people to relieve themselves without braving the cold outdoors, but they introduced their own problems. The pots had to be emptied carefully, often by women or servants, who bore the unpleasant task of dumping waste into designated middens or cesspools outside. This chore was especially grim in freezing conditions when the waste might freeze partially, making disposal even more difficult. The lingering smell in winter was another torment. Cold air slowed decomposition, so odors that might dissipate quickly in warmer weather hung stubbornly around the outhouse and nearby areas. The chill could trap smells beneath layers of frost, making each visit to the outhouse a challenging sensory experience. Medieval sanitation practices were far from the hygienic standards we expect today. The freezing of outhouses in winter highlighted the precariousness of the systems peasants relied on. Without modern septic systems or sewage treatment, waste management was a communal problem fraught with health risks, especially during the cold months when freezing made handling waste even more problematic. Health-wise, the frozen outhouse could contribute indirectly to the spread of disease. With waste unable to decompose properly and the difficulty of disposing of chamber pot contents, contamination of water sources and living spaces was a real danger. Villagers understood these risks, but options were limited by technology, resources, and knowledge. The frozen outhouse also shaped social behaviors and rhythms. In the dead of winter, villagers might delay their trips outside or ration their use of chamber pots to minimize exposure to cold and unpleasant tasks. The communal nature of sanitation meant that the whole village's well-being depended on each person's actions and how well the pit was maintained during the fleeting warmer months. This seasonal freezing problem wasn't unique to any single region, but was a widespread reality across Northern Europe and other cold climates during the medieval period. It shaped not only hygiene practices, but also architectural choices, community organization, and daily routines. For instance, some villages adapted by building outhouses on insulated platforms or in sheltered locations to reduce freezing. Others used straw or ash to cover waste, hoping to promote partial decomposition despite the cold. Still, none of these measures fully overcame the fundamental challenge posed by winter's grip. The outhouse that froze solid was a stark reminder of how intimately medieval life was tied to the elements. Nature's cycles dictated not only work and rest, but also the most basic bodily functions. This reality bred resilience and ingenuity, but also underscored the vulnerability of peasant communities to the harshness of their environment. In reflecting on this, we gain insight into the lived experience of medieval villagers, their endurance through discomfort, their adaptations born of necessity, and the unglamorous yet vital tasks that formed the backbone of daily life. The frozen outhouse is more than a quirky historical fact. It symbolizes the intersection of environment, technology, and human perseverance in a world without modern conveniences. Through this lens, the medieval outhouse becomes a testament to the strength required to face even the smallest challenges when survival depended on every breath, every action, and every choice made under the watchful eye of a harsh, unyielding winter. The neighbors. Already yelling outside. Imagine waking up not to the gentle quiet of a modern morning, but to a cacophony of sounds spilling through thin walls and open windows. A world where privacy was scarce, and the boundaries between your home and your neighbor's life were blurred beyond distinction. In medieval villages and early towns, homes were tightly packed, often made from wattle and daub or timber, with walls so thin that every murmur traveled easily. As dawn broke, the village came alive, not just with the crow of roosters, but with a chorus of everyday noises: the bleating of sheep, the braying of donkeys, the clucking of chickens, the sharp calls of market vendors, and the unmistakable sound of neighbors already shouting, arguing, or negotiating deals outside your door. This auditory landscape was an integral part of communal living. Unlike today's emphasis on individual space and quiet, medieval life was deeply communal and interdependent. Families and neighbors shared more than just physical proximity. They shared news, work, celebrations, and conflicts. The sounds that greeted villagers each morning were the soundtrack of social life itself, a mix of livelihood and human connection that shaped how communities functioned and bonded. Thin walls and shared spaces meant that privacy was a luxury few could afford. Inside homes, conversations were overheard, secrets risked exposure, and personal affairs became public knowledge. This created a social dynamic where reputations mattered deeply, and the boundary between public and private was fluid. People were aware that their neighbors could hear their words, disputes, and even their silence. This fostered a culture where social behavior was regulated not only by law, but by the ever-present gaze and ear of the community. Livestock noises were unavoidable companions to early risers. Animals were kept close for protection and ease of care, often just outside or even within dwellings during harsh weather. Their early morning sounds were signals of daily chores to come: milking cows, feeding pigs, or preparing horses for work. These animal sounds intertwined with human voices, creating a rich tapestry of rural life that echoed through streets and alleyways. The yelling neighbors were not just a nuisance, but also a sign of life's urgency and communal interactivity. Market deals were struck at dawn to ensure goods reached buyers in time. Family disputes flared and cooled in public spaces. Urgent news, rumors, or warnings passed quickly through vocal exchanges. This immediacy of communication was essential in a world where written messages were rare and slow, and where face-to-face interaction was the primary means of connection. This noisy morning reality reflected the social and economic structure of village life. Most people were tied to the land or local trades, dependent on daily cooperation and mutual support. The close quarters reinforced communal responsibility, but also magnified tensions. Conflicts were public, celebrations shared, and the rhythm of life collectively felt. This environment shaped people's behavior and relationships, teaching them to negotiate coexistence amid constant sensory intrusion. They learned to listen carefully, interpret layered conversations, and even find humor or comfort in the familiar morning ruckus. The neighbors' yelling was both an alarm and a bond, a reminder that none lived truly alone. In contemplating this, we can appreciate how modern concepts of privacy and quietude are relatively recent developments. The intimate mingling of sound in medieval villages was not merely background noise, but a vital force weaving together the fabric of community life. The sounds that invaded your morning, the shouting neighbors, the bleating animals, the crackling fires, were the first signs of a day shared, a world alive with human presence and interaction. Understanding this sonic world enriches our view of history, revealing how sound shaped social order, communication, and daily survival. It invites us to listen more deeply to the past, hearing not just silence, but the vibrant, sometimes chaotic chorus that once greeted every dawn. The neighbors already yelling outside were the heralds of a living, breathing village, imperfect, noisy, connected, and their voices still echo in the story of human coexistence, the smoke that made your eyes burn. Waking up in a medieval or early modern home was not like flicking on a light switch and breathing clean air. The very first sensation for many was the sting of smoke filling their lungs and eyes. The indoor fires that provided warmth, light, and a means to cook often lacked chimneys or proper ventilation. Instead, smoke from the hearth and oil lamps billowed freely into the living spaces, settling thickly in the air and on every surface. This pervasive smoke was an unavoidable part of daily life, and it shaped the experience of waking, breathing, and living in those times. Before chimneys became widespread in Europe during the late Middle Ages, hearths were typically large open fires located centrally within a room or home. The smoke produced by burning wood, peat, or coal escaped only through holes in the roof or small vents, often mixing with the occupant's breath. The architecture of homes was designed more for protection from weather and enemies than for smoke removal, meaning the indoor atmosphere was perpetually thick with fumes. The consequence was that upon waking, people often found themselves coughing and blinking through tears caused by smoke-irritated eyes. The acrid air would have coated their lungs, leaving a heavy, choking sensation. This was an accepted discomfort, a normal part of life that few had the luxury to avoid. The smell of smoke was so ingrained in daily existence that it became as familiar as the sound of morning birds or the chill of dawn. Oil lamps, used to extend light into the darker hours, added another source of smoke and soot. These lamps burned animal fats or vegetable oils, producing a dim, flickering flame accompanied by a steady plume of smoke. In tightly enclosed spaces, The concentration of these fumes could be intense, contributing to respiratory irritation and poor indoor air quality. People shared these smoky rooms closely with their families, often sleeping near the hearth for warmth despite the discomfort. This smoky environment had profound effects on health. Chronic exposure to indoor smoke caused respiratory ailments like bronchitis and chronic cough. Eyes regularly stung, and many people developed a persistent, smoky smell on their clothes and skin. The air inside homes was polluted daily, and yet it was necessary to keep fires burning for survival. The smoke that made eyes burn was also a constant reminder of human resilience and adaptation. People found ways to mitigate its effects, opening windows or doors when possible, hanging herbs believed to purify the air, or using specific seating arrangements to stay slightly above the smoke level. Yet, the lack of proper ventilation was a challenge that shaped architectural innovations over centuries, eventually leading to the development of chimneys and more advanced hearth designs. Culturally, the smoke-filled room was a gathering place. Despite discomfort, families and communities bonded around the hearth, sharing warmth, stories, and meals. The smoky atmosphere was the backdrop for social and domestic life, marking the start of the day and its routines. The very smoke that burned their eyes also drew people together, creating a shared experience of hardship and intimacy. Historical records and archaeological studies reveal the slow but significant transition from open hearths to chimneys in European homes. This change not only improved air quality, but also altered social dynamics within households. The smoke no longer filled living spaces as it had for centuries, allowing for cleaner air, better health, and new architectural possibilities. Understanding the smoke that made eyes burn connects us to a fundamental reality of past lives, how survival often demanded enduring discomfort and adapting to imperfect conditions. It invites empathy for ancestors who faced daily challenges we rarely consider, reminding us of the progress achieved and the resilience it required. Next time you light a fire or an oil lamp, remember the countless generations who lived and woke, surrounded by smoke's sting. Their mornings began with burning eyes and choking breaths, a harsh welcome to a new day that nonetheless carried hope, warmth, and the promise of continued life. This smoky reality shaped not just the physical environment, but the very rhythms of daily existence, how people moved, interacted, and persisted through centuries of smoky dawns. It was a small but profound thread in the vast tapestry of human history, illuminating the endurance that fueled civilization's slow but steady advance, the alarm that was a scream. In the quiet darkness of a medieval village or town, before the invention of mechanical clocks or widespread bells, life's alarms were raw, human, and immediate. The piercing scream of a woman in labor, the desperate wails of an injured animal, or the sudden outcry of a thief caught in the act, all served as urgent signals that shattered the night's stillness. These were not mere noises, but vital messages carrying weight and urgency, compelling everyone within earshot to awaken and respond. Before artificial alarms or standardized timekeeping devices, people relied on natural and social cues to mark moments of urgency. The scream was among the most primal and effective of these. It was a call that needed no language or explanation. Its intensity cut through fatigue and fear, reaching every corner of the village. The scream acted as both a warning and a summons, alerting neighbors to danger, need, or crisis, and compelling collective attention. A woman in labor was a profound event in medieval life, marked by both hope and peril. Without hospitals or modern medical care, childbirth was a communal experience often managed at home with midwives, family members, and neighbors. When a woman's labor pains intensified, cries and screams announced the critical moment. These sounds summoned help, reassurance, and spiritual support. Villagers understood that the mother's cries were more than personal pain. They were signals that life was at a delicate threshold, demanding immediate presence and care. Similarly, the anguished cry of an injured animal held significance beyond mere distress. Livestock were vital assets, sources of food, labor, and income. An animal's scream alerted owners and neighbors to injury, attack, or illness that required urgent attention. The survival of these animals impacted the entire household's livelihood, so these cries were taken seriously. They served as early warnings of threats from predators or accidents and galvanized swift responses. Then there were the alarms of human danger. The thief caught in the night, startled into screaming by a sudden confrontation. Theft and burglary were real dangers in medieval communities, where wealth was scarce and property hard-won. The thief's scream or the victim's shout alerted neighbors to potential violence or loss. In times before police or formal law enforcement, the community itself acted as guardian and judge. Hearing a scream meant readiness to defend, investigate, or intervene. These cries functioned as impromptu alarm systems, relying on human empathy and communal vigilance. The social fabric of the village was woven through these moments of shared awareness and collective response. No one could afford to ignore a scream in the night. Doing so risked lives, property, and the fragile balance of community safety. The architecture and layout of medieval villages amplified these cries. Houses were clustered close together, often with thin walls and open windows, allowing sounds to travel quickly. Streets were narrow, so a scream could echo and be heard far beyond its source. At night, when the usual bustle quieted, the sudden scream was even more pronounced, a sharp spike in an otherwise muted soundscape. The cultural and spiritual dimensions of these cries added layers of meaning. In many medieval societies, screams during childbirth were accompanied by prayers, rituals, and the presence of holy relics or charms intended to protect mother and child. Similarly, the scream signaling danger invoked communal prayers or preparations for defense. The line between the physical and spiritual realms was thin, and the scream bridged these worlds, awakening both body and soul. This alarm system was imperfect and fraught with challenges. False alarms could cause panic, and some cries might go unheard due to distance or sleep depth. Yet, it was a system rooted in immediacy and human connection, one that depended on the shared vigilance and responsiveness of the community. The scream demanded attention because it was impossible to ignore. It was the sound of survival itself. In this way, the scream as an alarm underscores the medieval intertwining of personal pain, communal responsibility, and survival. It reminds us that before the mechanical precision of modern timekeeping, the rhythms of life were dictated by human voices, raw, urgent, and powerful. These cries marked the boundaries between safety and danger, sleep and wakefulness, solitude and solidarity. So, when imagining a medieval night suddenly broken by a scream, envision not just a noise, but a vital thread connecting neighbors, signaling life's fragility and the communal will to protect, assist, and endure. The alarm that was a scream was the village's call to arms, its reminder that in a harsh and uncertain world, every voice mattered, and every response could mean the difference between survival and loss. The first food was often leftovers. The morning meal in medieval and early modern societies was far from the fresh, carefully prepared breakfasts we know today. For most common people, the first food of the day was often whatever remained from the previous evening: stale bread dipped in sour ale or cold broth saved from last night's stew. This practice was shaped by economic necessity, limited resources, and the rhythms of daily life, revealing much about historical food culture, social structures, and survival strategies. In a world without refrigeration or modern preservation, fresh food was a rare luxury, especially in rural and poorer urban communities. Baking fresh bread daily was a labor-intensive task, and ovens were communal and costly to operate, so households baked in batches, making bread that would last several days. By morning, bread was often hard, dry, or stale. Rather than waste it, people soaked it in liquid to soften it, commonly ale or beer, which was widely consumed as a safer alternative to potentially contaminated water. This practice was practical and efficient. Softening the bread made it edible and filling, while the ale added calories and hydration. Leftover broth or pottage from the previous night's cooking was another staple of breakfast. Large pots of stew or soup cooked overnight or in the evening provided a reserve of warm nourishment. Eating these leftovers in the morning was a sensible way to conserve food and energy, especially during harsh winters or times of scarcity. These broths were simple, often vegetable-based with occasional meat or grains, but they provided vital sustenance to start the day. Breakfast as a formal meal was not always culturally emphasized. In many medieval societies, the day's main meal was eaten at midday, with a lighter evening meal following. Morning eating was sometimes minimal, partly because physical labor demanded sustained energy later in the day, and because early rising without fresh food was simply a fact of life. Monastic rules, for example, often prescribed limited or no solid food before midday, reflecting religious discipline rather than mere habit. The social stratification of food was also apparent in morning meals. Nobility and wealthy merchants might enjoy fresher foods, including meats, cheeses, and freshly baked bread, but even they often relied on leftovers or simple fare to begin the day. For peasants and laborers, leftover bread soaked in ale and cold broth was common fare, reflecting their constrained means. This disparity illustrates how food practices mirrored wider social inequalities. Economically, wasting food was unthinkable. The idea of discarding stale bread or broth was counterproductive in subsistence economies where every morsel mattered. Households carefully saved and reused food, a habit born out of necessity, but also fostering a culture of thrift and resourcefulness. This recycling of food extended to many parts of the diet and was intertwined with seasonal availability and preservation methods such as drying, salting, and fermenting. The texture and taste of these breakfasts might seem unappetizing to modern palates, but they were practical solutions to the challenges of food availability and safety. Ale, for example, was brewed daily and was often weak but nourishing, serving as a dietary staple as much as a beverage. The soaking of bread in ale was thus a means to increase hydration and caloric intake simultaneously. Broth or pottage left from previous meals was similarly a concentrated source of nutrition, often enriched with whatever vegetables, grains, or scraps were available. This way of eating also reflected the cyclical and communal nature of medieval food preparation. Food was often prepared in a central hearth or communal oven, shared among family or community members. Leftovers were shared, saved, and consumed in ways that connected people to their environment, to each other, and to the constraints of their material world. Understanding the practice of eating leftovers for breakfast opens a window into the lived experience of ordinary people in the past. It reveals how food was a scarce and precious resource, managed with care and adapted to the limitations of technology and environment. It also highlights the resilience and ingenuity of those who navigated daily life with limited means but deep knowledge of how to sustain themselves. So, the first food of the day was not a freshly cooked feast, but a humble, pragmatic meal, a softened piece of bread soaked in ale, or a bowl of cold broth. This simple fare fueled the day's labor and underscored a fundamental truth of historical life. Survival often depended on making the most of what remained, turning yesterday's sustenance into today's strength. The morning prayer, said in silence. In the early hours before the sun fully rose, medieval villages stirred not only with the sounds of roosters crowing and animals stirring, but with a more subtle, profound ritual. The morning prayer said in silence. For devout villagers, the break of dawn was a sacred threshold, a liminal moment where the boundary between the physical world and the spiritual realm seemed thin and permeable. This was a time to seek protection, blessings, and strength to face the day's hardships, often whispered quietly or spoken inwardly as the world gradually awakened. Unlike the public prayers rung out by church bells or proclaimed from pulpits, the morning prayers of peasants were deeply personal and often silent. Villagers, grounded in a worldview where unseen forces, both divine and demonic, exerted constant influence, believed that these whispered invocations were crucial. They sought to shield themselves, their families, and their livestock from illness, misfortune, and malevolent spirits that folklore warned could lurk in the dawn's fragile light. This practice was more than mere superstition. It was embedded in a religious and cultural fabric that permeated every aspect of life. The medieval church taught that prayer was a weapon and shield, and in rural communities where formal clergy might be distant or absent, the faithful took personal responsibility to maintain spiritual vigilance. The morning prayer was both an act of devotion and a form of spiritual armor. Often these prayers were said while performing essential chores, milking cows, fetching water, tending fires, or preparing food. This simultaneous weaving of work and worship reflects the medieval mindset where the sacred and the mundane were inseparable. Life was a continuous offering, and even the simplest tasks were opportunities to connect with God and seek divine grace. The silent nature of these prayers also reveals much about the environment and social dynamics of the time. Speaking prayers aloud was not always practical or safe, especially during moments requiring concentration or in settings where noise might disturb others. Whispering or silent recitation allowed villagers to maintain reverence and focus amid the bustle of morning activity. In some traditions, the exact words or prayers might have been passed down orally through families or local customs, blending Christian liturgy with folk beliefs. Invocations to saints, the Lord's Prayer, or personalized petitions were common, often tailored to the immediate concerns of health, protection, and success in the day's labor. The dawn itself held symbolic power. It was seen as a time of renewal, when darkness retreated and light conquered evil. Prayers at this hour were believed especially potent because they were offered during this sacred transition. The whispered words acted like a spiritual barrier, a beacon of light pushing back shadows and ensuring that the forces of harm could not take hold. Medieval illness was often attributed not just to physical causes, but to spiritual or supernatural origins. Demons, curses, and ill will from neighbors were feared sources of sickness. Thus, prayer was a frontline defense, a daily ritual to safeguard life and community well-being. Silent morning prayers were a humble but vital tool in this struggle against unseen threats. The communal nature of the village amplified the importance of these prayers. Though spoken privately, the collective energy of many whispered invocations created a tapestry of protection around the community. It was an unspoken bond, a shared belief that united individuals in mutual care through spiritual practice. Understanding the morning prayer said in silence deepens our appreciation for the intimate ways medieval people related to their faith and environment. It reminds us that beyond grand cathedrals and formal liturgy, faith lived in the quiet moments of daily toil and whispered hope. This practice embodies a world where the divine was close, where every dawn held promise, and where prayer was both a necessity and a comfort. In a time when life was fragile and unpredictable, the simple act of whispering a prayer at dawn was a profound assertion of hope, resilience, and connection to something greater. It was a whispered lifeline bridging the mortal and the eternal, guiding villagers through the challenges of their day with spiritual strength and silent grace. The ashes that told if you'd live long. In the quiet stillness of morning, long before voices filled the village streets or roosters crowed, there was a ritual older than many could recall, a moment when the fate of a household seemed to hang in the fragile remnants of a dying fire. Villagers would rise and turn their eyes toward the hearth, the very heart of their home, where ashes lay thick and gray. These ashes were not merely the remnants of burnt wood or peat. They were silent messengers, whispering omens about life, death, and fortune. For generations, the hearth had been the center of family life, warming bodies, cooking food, and fostering community. But it was also a spiritual hearth, a place where the boundary between the physical world and unseen forces was thin. The condition of the ashes left from the night's fire was read carefully each dawn, a practice steeped in belief and tradition. To see the ashes still glowing faintly, holding on to a subtle warmth or a whisper of ember, was a hopeful sign. It meant life persisted, protection remained, and the household's fortunes were intact. But if the ashes were cold and lifeless, if the fire had gone out completely in the night, it was more than just a practical problem. It was a bad omen. Such a sight filled hearts with dread, a portent of hardship, illness, or even death to come. The extinguished hearth symbolized vulnerability, an opening through which misfortune or malevolent forces could enter. This belief was widespread across many cultures and eras, a deeply ingrained understanding that the fire's survival mirrored the life force of the family it warmed. In many villages, the morning inspection of the ashes was a solemn ritual performed by the head of the household or an elder, someone steeped in tradition and attuned to these signs. They would approach the hearth with reverence, sometimes accompanied by whispered prayers or offerings, seeking guidance and protection. If the fire had died, they might quickly rekindle it with fresh kindling and embers, hoping to restore warmth and ward off ill fate. In some communities, special herbs or incense were burned alongside the new fire, intended to cleanse the home and repel dark spirits. This ritual was not merely superstition, but a vital psychological anchor in a world fraught with uncertainty. In times when disease, famine, and violence loomed large and inexplicable, these small acts provided a sense of control and hope. The hearth and its ashes became symbols of continuity. When the fire endured, so did the family. When it failed, it demanded immediate attention, a call to protect what was most precious. Historically, the significance of the hearth ashes also intersected with practical concerns. A fire that went out overnight could mean cold, damp conditions that threatened food supplies and comfort. Rekindling the fire was urgent, not just spiritually, but materially. The care and maintenance of the hearth were central to daily life, making the morning ashes both a physical and metaphysical checkpoint. Folklore and legends often wove this belief into stories of household spirits or guardians who dwelled in the flames and ashes. Maintaining a burning hearth was seen as honoring these entities, securing their favor and protection. The ashes, therefore, held dual meaning, as evidence of the fire's life and as a record of the unseen forces watching over the home. In a broader sense, this ancient practice reflects how humans have always sought meaning in the natural world's rhythms and signs. The morning ashes were a mirror reflecting hopes and fears, a daily reminder that life is fragile and must be nurtured with care and vigilance. This attention to the hearth state linked communities to cycles of nature, seasons, and the ever-turning wheel of existence. Even now, in modern homes far removed from open hearths and ash-covered floors, the legacy of this ritual lingers in our language and customs. Phrases like, "keeping the home fires burning," carry echoes of these old beliefs about protection, endurance, and hope. The ashes that once foretold life's course remind us how deeply intertwined our survival was, and remains, with the elemental forces of fire. So when you imagine the early morning scene, a villager bending close to the hearth, brushing away dust to reveal glowing embers or cold gray ash, you see more than a chore. You glimpse a moment charged with meaning, where fire and fate converge, where a family's future was quietly weighed on the fragile balance of flame and ash. This was the fire that warmed the body and the spirit, the smoke that guarded the night, and the ashes that told if you'd live long. The chickens that slept inside. In the everyday tapestry of medieval life, the presence of animals was woven intimately into the fabric of human existence. Chickens and pigs were not just livestock. They were vital sources of food, income, and security. Yet these animals were also vulnerable, susceptible to theft, predators, and the harsh elements. To protect these valuable creatures, medieval households often made the unusual choice of allowing them to sleep indoors, bringing them into the same spaces where families lived and worked. This decision shaped the sensory landscape of the home, where waking up meant stepping carefully over straw, feathers, and the inevitable traces of animal life. The theft of livestock was a real and persistent threat in medieval communities. Chickens and pigs, small enough to be stolen easily, but valuable enough to affect a family's survival, attracted thieves and opportunists. Nighttime was especially perilous, as darkness concealed movement and kept watchfulness low. To guard against this, many peasants and townsfolk adapted by sheltering their animals inside, often in the same room or adjoining spaces used by the family. This practice turned living quarters into multifunctional areas, a bedroom, kitchen, and barn, all in one. Bringing animals indoors was a practical security measure, but one that came with challenges. The floors, usually made of packed dirt or simple planks, were covered with layers of straw to provide bedding both for humans and animals. Waking meant navigating a landscape littered with feathers from chickens preening or molting, and the unavoidable presence of dung. The smells, textures, and sounds of these animals were part of daily life, constant reminders of the close bond and dependence between humans and their livestock. This closeness created a unique sensory environment. The soft rustling of feathers, the clucking and snuffling of animals, and the occasional squawk or grunt mingled with the sounds of human movement. The warmth generated by animals helped heat the room during cold nights, providing a mutual benefit. Yet the presence of animals indoors also brought health risks, including parasites and diseases that thrived in such close quarters, a reality not fully understood or controlled at the time. The arrangement was a stark contrast to modern ideas of hygiene and separation of living and farming spaces. But in the medieval world, survival often trumped comfort or cleanliness. The line between domestic space and animal pen was blurred, reflecting a worldview where humans and animals lived in close, interdependent communities. This intermingling influenced routines and rituals, from how people dressed to how they slept, always mindful of the animals sharing their space. Historical records and archaeological findings support this practice. Straw embedded with chicken feathers and manure has been uncovered in medieval dwelling sites, confirming that animals were commonly housed indoors. Literature and legal documents from the period mention disputes over livestock theft and the protective measures taken by families, underscoring the importance of this practice. This closeness to animals shaped not only physical spaces, but social and economic relations. Families depended on the animals' well-being for sustenance and trade. Their protection was paramount, influencing architectural choices such as creating dedicated animal enclosures within the home or building lofts and stalls. The decision to let chickens and pigs sleep indoors was a compromise, a trade-off between security and the challenges of shared living. Waking up in such a home meant engaging directly with this complex environment. Bare feet touched straw-strewn floors, hands brushed away feathers, noses and lungs inhaled the mingled scents of earth, animals, and human life. The act of rising was a negotiation between comfort and necessity, a moment where the boundary between human and animal worlds was palpably crossed. This practice also reveals broader truths about medieval rural life. It was a world of resourcefulness, adaptation, and close relationships with the natural and animal worlds. The house was not a sanctuary from nature, but a space where humans and animals coexisted, each shaping the daily experience of the other. The chickens and pigs that slept inside were both protectors and participants in the household's survival strategy. Understanding this sheds light on how medieval people managed risk and scarcity. Theft was not an abstract fear, but a daily concern addressed through practical, if imperfect, solutions. The presence of animals indoors was a physical manifestation of this constant vigilance, a shared space of safety and vulnerability. So, when imagining the medieval dawn, picture waking not in a silent, pristine bedroom, but in a lively, layered environment where the stirrings of chickens and pigs blend with human activity. To rise meant stepping carefully, aware of the straw beneath and the creatures sharing your world. The chickens that slept inside were more than livestock. They were part of the household's heartbeat, inseparable from the rhythm of medieval life itself. The dew that soaked your only shoes. In the world of medieval peasants, every possession was precious, and leather shoes were no exception. Unlike today, where footwear is abundant and often taken for granted, owning a pair of shoes in a village was a significant investment. They were costly to make, requiring skilled craftsmanship, expensive materials, and time. For many peasants, a single pair of sturdy leather shoes was all they had, a vital tool to protect their feet through long days of labor in fields, forests, and rough terrain. Yet, despite their importance, peasants did not keep their shoes indoors at night. This was not due to carelessness, but necessity. Medieval homes, typically made of wood, wattle, and daub, often heated by open hearths, were tinder boxes. Fires were common and devastating, so villagers took great care to reduce any risk. Shoes, made of leather and often treated with oils or tars, could easily catch fire or smolder. To avoid the danger, shoes were commonly left outside the home, placed near doorways or on wooden racks when available. This practice, however, exposed shoes to the elements, especially the heavy moisture of early morning dew. During the long nights, dew formed as a natural result of cooling air condensing moisture onto surfaces. By dawn, leather shoes left outside were often soaked, heavy with water that seeped into the fibers. The consequences were significant. Peasants faced the day wearing damp, cold footwear that could cause discomfort, chafing, and even health problems such as chilblains or infections. But the reality of medieval life left little room for choice. Drying shoes overnight was a luxury that many could not afford because of limited space, lack of safe indoor storage, or simply the necessity to keep footwear out of the fire's reach. Wearing wet shoes was an accepted hardship, endured as part of daily survival. This constant exposure to moisture also impacted the longevity of the shoes. Leather, when soaked repeatedly, would stiffen, crack, or rot if not properly maintained. Peasants had to be vigilant in caring for their shoes, oiling, drying when possible, and repairing worn soles. Yet even the best care could not fully protect shoes from the relentless dampness of the environment. The soaked shoes were more than just a physical discomfort. They symbolized the intersection of safety, practicality, and resource scarcity that defined peasant existence. The very act of leaving shoes outside to avoid fire risk introduced a daily challenge, reminding villagers of the precarious balance they maintained between protection and hardship. Additionally, wearing damp shoes all day affected the rhythm and quality of work. Cold, wet feet reduced stamina, increased fatigue, and heightened vulnerability to illness. Yet peasants persevered, driven by necessity and a stoic acceptance of the conditions imposed by their world. This reality also speaks to the broader relationship medieval peasants had with their environment and possessions. Everything was multi-purpose, carefully used, and intimately connected to survival. Shoes were not merely fashion or comfort. They were tools, armor against the roughness of rural life, and symbols of a fragile stability. In reflecting on the dew that soaked a peasant's only shoes, we glimpse a life where comfort was scarce, resilience was essential, and every detail, down to the moisture clinging to leather, carried weight. It is a small but profound testament to endurance, adaptation, and the humble dignity of those who lived with the land and weather as constant companions. Through this lens, the soaked shoes tell a story of a world where safety precautions met natural forces in daily struggle, where the risks of fire and cold shaped simple habits, and where the line between protection and discomfort was a thin, damp one. It is a reminder of the unvarnished realities behind medieval life's seemingly small details, realities defined by survival, care, and the persistent presence of nature's touch at every step. The child sent to wake the blacksmith. Before the hum of machines and the clatter of factories, the blacksmith's forge was the beating heart of every village and town. This skilled artisan shaped metal with fire and hammer, crafting tools, weapons, horseshoes, and countless essentials that kept daily life moving. Because of the blacksmith's vital role, the morning often began with a ritual urgency. A child dispatched at dawn, tasked with knocking on the smithy's door to rouse the craftsman and request the repair or creation of nails, hinges, plow parts, or other urgent items needed to keep farms productive and homes secure. This early errand was no casual task. The blacksmith's work was the backbone of agricultural and domestic stability. Without functional tools and equipment, farmers could not till the soil, builders could not repair structures, and transportation would falter. Sending a child to wake the blacksmith was a practical necessity born of the rhythms of rural life, where time was measured by the rising sun and the pressing demands of the day. Children, often trusted helpers in their households, were chosen for these errands because of their agility, knowledge of neighbors, and ability to navigate the narrow lanes and clustered homes of the village. Their knocking was a sharp, insistent signal cutting through the morning quiet, a summons that the blacksmith's forge must soon roar to life. The errand was noisy and urgent. No one could afford delay, for the pace of work depended on timely metalwork. The child's journey to the smithy was also a social moment. It reinforced community ties as they passed through familiar streets, greeted neighbors, and sometimes overheard snippets of gossip or news. The role fostered responsibility and trust in young villagers, embedding them early into the fabric of communal cooperation. The blacksmith's workshop was a place of both practical labor and social exchange, a forge not only of metal but of relationships. The blacksmith's early morning work was demanding and technical. Managing the fire's heat, selecting the right metals, and skillfully shaping items required experience and precision. The arrival of the child's message spurred the craftsman into immediate action, transforming raw materials into the tools and hardware vital for survival. The clanging of hammer on anvil, the hiss of water on hot metal, and the rhythmic pulse of the forge defined the village's auditory landscape at dawn. This ritual highlights the interdependence within historical communities. Every role, from the youngest child to the master smith, was interconnected in a chain that sustained life. The urgency of the errand reflects the delicate balance of rural economies where timing, skill, and cooperation were essential. Missing a single nail or broken hinge could delay planting or repair, with ripple effects on food production and shelter. Moreover, the role of children in such errands illustrates how early responsibility was woven into childhood. Far from idle or sheltered, young people contributed actively to their families and communities, learning trades, social norms, and the value of reliability through daily tasks. The blacksmith wake-up call was a rite of passage and a practical necessity, a moment where youthful energy met the needs of village survival. Looking back, this scene encapsulates the blend of urgency, craft, and communal life that defined pre-industrial societies. The child sent to wake the blacksmith was a messenger of continuity, carrying the hopes of a new day, the needs of the community, and the promise that fire and hammer would once again transform raw metal into tools of life. It was a moment full of sound, purpose, and human connection, a small but indispensable thread in the vast tapestry of history. In remembering this daily ritual, we glimpse the pulse of a world where every member, regardless of age, had a role to play in sustaining life. The blacksmith's forge was more than a workshop. It was a lifeline, and the child knocking at dawn was the herald of its essential work, reminding us that behind every tool and repair lay the hands and hearts of an engaged, interwoven community. The town crier, who broke the silence. Before the relentless hum of modern communication, before newspapers, radios, or smartphones, towns and villages relied on one essential figure to carry the voice of authority and news, the town crier. At the break of dawn, as the first light spilled over rooftops and sleepy streets, the town crier's booming voice shattered the silence, announcing news, punishments, or new laws to every ear within earshot. This was a vital ritual that shaped daily life, social order, and the collective consciousness of communities for centuries. The role of the town crier was far more than just a messenger. They were the living broadcast system of their time. In an era when literacy rates were low and printed materials scarce or expensive, the spoken word was the primary way to disseminate information. The crier's announcements were a public service, carrying vital instructions and news that affected everyone, from market days and tax collections to proclamations of justice and royal decrees. At sunrise, the town crier would step into the square or street, often clad in colorful robes and bearing a bell or staff to capture attention. The ringing of the bell pierced the dawn quiet, signaling that an important message was coming. Then, with a voice trained for volume and clarity, the crier would proclaim the news, ensuring even the heaviest sleepers were roused. This wake-up call was as much about alertness as it was about asserting the presence of law and governance in daily life. The power of the crier's voice was immense. Their announcements could summon the community for emergencies, warn of impending dangers like fires or invasions, or communicate punishments meted out by authorities. Sometimes, the crier's words held a mixture of fear and hope, reminding citizens of their duties while promising protection or order. The town crier was a bridge between rulers and the ruled, translating distant decrees into urgent, understandable commands. Historically, this role had deep roots in medieval and early modern Europe, but similar figures existed in cultures worldwide. In England, for instance, the office of the town crier was formalized by royal appointment. Criers were often granted legal protections because they represented the authority of the crown. Their job was dangerous. Sometimes they had to deliver harsh news or risk public anger, but it was crucial for maintaining social cohesion and order. The timing of their announcements, just at dawn, was deliberate and effective. Morning was the threshold between rest and work, a moment when the whole community was gathering strength to begin the day. By breaking the silence of the early hour, the town crier ensured that no one missed vital information that could impact their lives, livelihoods, or safety. The booming voice was a call to attention, an auditory anchor around which the day's activities would revolve. The town crier's work was also deeply symbolic. Their presence in the public square represented transparency and the reach of law into every corner of society. They were reminders that no matter how isolated one's home or work, the community and its rules touched every individual. In times of conflict or uncertainty, the crier's voice could be a source of stability, a channel of communication that reassured or warned. Interestingly, the tradition of town criers continues in some places today, often as ceremonial figures or in historical reenactments, preserving a link to this ancient form of communication. Their legacy lives on in the ways we value clear, authoritative public announcements and in the power of voice to unite and inform communities. Imagining the town crier's call piercing the calm morning air, an explosive voice that shakes windows and stirs the sleepiest, connects us to a time when information was scarce but powerfully wielded. The crier did more than wake people. They wove the social fabric tighter, commanding attention, respect, and obedience with every proclamation. So when dawn breaks and silence fades, remember the town crier who broke the quiet, not just with sound, but with the weight of communal life itself. Their booming announcements were the heartbeat of the village, the voice that carried law, news, and order, waking the world to the reality of a new day, the chickens that vanished overnight. In the fragile world of medieval villages and hamlets, the morning light often brought more than just the start of a new day. It brought grim discoveries. As dawn broke and people rose to begin their work, many faced unsettling realities. Chickens, pigs, or other livestock gone without a trace. Tools vanished from their humble workshops. Possessions mysteriously disappeared from storage. These losses were not mere inconveniences. They were blows to survival, threatening the delicate balance of daily life. The chickens that vanished overnight were silent testimonies to deeper dangers lurking within or beyond the community. Livestock theft was a pervasive and feared problem. Chickens, being small and easily hidden, were frequent targets. The loss of even a few birds could impact a family's food supply, economic standing, and ability to trade. Tools, often handmade and precious, represented hours of labor and vital resources for farming, cooking, or crafting. Their disappearance hindered productivity and deepened the hardships already endured. The suspicion bred by such thefts ran deep. In close-knit communities where everyone knew each other's routines, a missing chicken could mean betrayal by a neighbor rather than a stranger. Trust was fragile. Accusations and tensions could flare, fracturing social bonds that were essential for cooperation and mutual aid. The fear that someone within the village might be a thief cast shadows over daily interactions, breeding paranoia alongside loss. But the threat was not only human. Villagers also feared wild animals, foxes, wolves, or stray dogs that prowled near settlements under cover of darkness. These predators preyed upon unattended livestock, tearing through coops and pens to snatch chickens or young pigs. Their presence was a reminder that the village's tenuous safety was constantly challenged by nature itself, an ever-present force outside human control. This dual threat, human and animal, shaped how communities guarded their resources. Protective measures included keeping animals indoors or in secure pens, organizing night watches, and sharing information about suspicious activity. Yet even these precautions were imperfect, and mornings often brought the harsh reality of what had been lost. The emotional toll of these vanishings was profound. The disappearance of animals or tools meant more than material loss. It meant anxiety, vulnerability, and the unsettling question of safety. Was the enemy among friends? Was the night truly safe? The psychological weight of these questions influenced behavior, leading some to isolate, others to confront, and many to live in cautious vigilance. Legal and social responses to theft varied. Some communities imposed harsh penalties for caught thieves, fines, public humiliation, or corporal punishment, intended to deter others. Yet proving guilt was challenging without modern investigative tools, and accusations could be as damaging as the theft itself. The delicate balance of justice and community harmony was constantly tested by these losses. The phenomenon of missing chickens and tools also reveals the precariousness of medieval rural life. Survival hinged on limited resources, careful stewardship, and the fragile goodwill of neighbors. The nighttime disappearance of possessions exposed the thin line between order and chaos, safety and danger. These vanishings became part of village lore and memory, stories shared by firesides and woven into the collective identity. They were reminders of hardship, but also of resilience, the enduring spirit of communities that faced losses yet continued to rebuild, protect, and persevere. So, when imagining the medieval morning that revealed the chickens that vanished overnight, envision not just empty coops or missing tools, but the ripple of fear and suspicion that spread through the village. Feel the weight of loss and the urgent desire to protect what remained. These disappearances were silent echoes of a world where every day was a battle to hold on to the fragile threads of life, trust, and survival. The window that showed a funeral procession. In many villages of medieval and early modern Europe, waking up to a funeral procession passing by your window was an unsettling but familiar reality. Death was an ever-present companion in daily life, woven into the fabric of existence so intimately that it could greet you even before your first meal. The window became a silent witness to this passage, a frame through which the cycle of life and death was seen, felt, and deeply understood by every member of the community. The frequency of death in these times was startling by today's standards. High infant mortality, rampant infectious diseases, poor sanitation, famine, and frequent outbreaks of plague or other epidemics meant that many families lost members regularly. Life expectancy was low, and funerals were not rare occasions, but recurring events marking the fragile boundary between life and afterlife. This constant presence of mortality shaped the worldview, customs, and emotional landscape of villagers. A funeral procession was a communal act of mourning and respect. Typically slow and somber, the line of mourners would carry the coffin from the deceased's home to the church or burial ground, accompanied by prayers, hymns, and ritual gestures. Villagers, neighbors, friends, even strangers, often joined the procession, reflecting the close-knit social fabric and shared recognition of mortality. Passing by houses, the procession marked the village's collective encounter with loss. The window's view of this procession held symbolic and emotional significance. For those inside, it was a moment of reflection on their own mortality and the transient nature of life. It reminded villagers that death was not distant or abstract, but near, inevitable, and part of everyday reality. This confrontation with death at the start of the day framed the lived experience, influencing attitudes towards faith, community, and the preciousness of life. The visibility of funerals from homes also reinforced social bonds and obligations. Witnessing a funeral procession reminded villagers of the importance of participation in communal rites and the support owed to grieving families. Funerals were not private affairs, but public events that reaffirmed social cohesion and collective identity. The procession passing by windows linked individual households to the wider community's shared cycle of life and loss. In many ways, death was normalized through these repeated encounters. The constant visibility of mourning and burial rituals shaped cultural practices, including how people prepared for death, cared for the sick, and remembered ancestors. It instilled a consciousness of the sacred and a practical acceptance that loss was a common experience binding the living and the dead. The proximity of death also influenced art, literature, and spiritual life. Medieval villages were often decorated with memento mori symbols, reminders of mortality intended to provoke reflection and repentance. The funeral procession itself was a living memento, parading the reality of death through the streets and into the hearts of villagers. This regular, visible presence of death molded a communal spirituality focused on the afterlife, salvation, and the hope of reunion beyond mortal suffering. The morning window view of a funeral procession was thus not merely a visual event, but a profound encounter with the rhythms of human existence. It was a silent, solemn moment where the sacred and mundane intersected, a reminder that every day was borrowed time, every life precious and fleeting. This view shaped the village's collective memory and resilience, fostering compassion, solidarity, and a deep understanding of life's fragile beauty. For those who lived in such times, seeing a funeral procession through the window before breakfast was a sober but vital part of their reality. It anchored the day in the truths of mortality and community, blending grief and hope in a cycle repeated countless times. The window that showed a funeral procession was a frame for life's ultimate passage, a daily meditation on death's place within the human story. Recognizing this aspect of historical life helps us appreciate the depth and complexity of past communities. It challenges modern sensibilities that often hide death away, revealing instead a world where mortality was faced openly and collectively. The morning's silent line of mourners was not only a farewell, but a shared acknowledgement of the bonds that connect all living beings across time. So imagine waking to that quiet, slow procession passing by your window, an echo of lives lived, lost, and remembered. It was a daily reminder that death was never far, and that in facing it together, communities found strength, meaning, and the courage to greet each new day. The distant howl that meant wolves. In the dense woodlands that bordered many medieval villages, a haunting sound often pierced the stillness of night, the distant howl of wolves. This eerie call was more than a mere background noise. It was a chilling signal that danger lurked nearby, a reminder that villagers lived on the edge of a wild and unforgiving world where predators prowled under the cloak of darkness. Wolves were among the most feared creatures in medieval Europe. Their presence was a constant threat to livestock, the backbone of peasant survival. Sheep, goats, and even cattle were vulnerable to nocturnal attacks. Unlike the domestic animals cared for during the day, they became easy prey once darkness fell. For villagers whose wealth, food, and livelihood depended on these animals, each howl could spell loss and hardship. The threat was compounded by the limited means of defense available to peasants. Villages were typically small and sparsely fortified, with only basic wooden fences or thorn hedges enclosing their livestock. Wolves, cunning and relentless, could exploit weaknesses in these barriers or seize unattended animals left to graze or rest outdoors. Waking to a wolf's howl was a moment fraught with anxiety. Villagers knew that an attack might have already begun or was imminent. The loss of livestock meant not only immediate hunger, but long-term economic strain. Replacing a flock was no simple matter. It required resources, time, and favorable seasons. Thus, the wolf's call was intertwined with fear, vigilance, and the fragile balance of rural life. The howling itself served multiple purposes in wolf behavior. It was a means of communication among pack members, signaling territory, rallying the group, or coordinating hunts. To villagers, however, it became a harbinger of misfortune. This natural sound resonated through the forests and hills, carrying an almost supernatural weight in the medieval imagination. Folklore and superstition amplified the wolves' menace. They were often cast as agents of evil or symbols of chaos, tied to legends of werewolves and dark forces. These beliefs intensified the villagers' dread, making the howls not only a physical threat, but a psychological burden. Efforts to protect livestock varied. Some communities organized night watches, where groups took turns guarding the animals with torches, weapons, or loud noises to scare off predators. Dogs, too, were used as protectors, their barking deterring some attacks. However, these measures were only partially effective against a determined wolf pack. The wolves' predation was part of a larger, often harsh relationship between humans and nature in medieval times. While villagers depended on the forests for firewood, game, and pasture, they also lived with the constant reminder that they were not the only inhabitants of the land. Predators like wolves embodied the wildness that had not been tamed and threatened the fragile human foothold. This precarious coexistence shaped daily rhythms and communal bonds. The wolf's howl at night could unite villagers in shared vigilance and foster a deep awareness of their environment. It was a call to protect, to watch, and to endure. In understanding the distant howl that meant wolves, we uncover a vivid portrait of medieval rural life, a world where survival hinged on guarding against threats seen and unseen, where the wild was never far away, and where every night carried the possibility of loss and danger. Through this haunting sound, we glimpse the resilience of a people attuned to the rhythms of nature, living with courage amid shadows, and forging lives in a landscape where the boundary between safety and peril was as thin as the cold night air through which the wolves howled. The prayer for no rain. Before the advent of modern weather forecasting and irrigation systems, farmers depended entirely on the mercy of the skies. Each morning, as dawn broke over fields and pastures, the sight of clouds carried immense significance, especially those dark, heavy clouds that signaled rain. But rain, while essential for growth, was a double-edged sword. Too much of it could devastate crops, flood fields, and disrupt the delicate balance upon which entire communities depended. This vulnerability gave rise to deeply ingrained rituals and prayers, pleas whispered or spoken aloud, asking the heavens for no rain, or at least for it to hold off long enough for crops to thrive and harvests to be gathered. The farmer's gaze was often the first act of the day, scanning the horizon for signs in the sky. Clouds were read as omens, with their shape, density, and movement interpreted through generations of experience and folklore. A sudden shift to gray could ignite anxiety as much as hope. The fear of flooding was well-founded. Saturated soil drowned root systems, causing plants to rot and die. Waterlogged fields became impossible to work, halting plowing, planting, or harvesting. Weeks of excessive rain could transform fertile farmland into swamps, drastically reducing yields and threatening food security for entire villages. Because survival hinged so heavily on the weather, farmers turned to spiritual practices to influence nature's caprice. The prayer for no rain was more than mere superstition. It was an expression of hope and desperation, a ritual to communicate with the unseen forces controlling their fate. These prayers were often communal, said together in the fields, at the church, or around village gatherings, binding people through shared faith and fear. They reinforced a worldview where human and divine forces were intertwined, and where the natural world was animated by powers beyond human control. Historical records show that various cultures developed ceremonies, offerings, and chants aimed at controlling or appeasing the elements. In medieval Europe, processions to holy sites, blessings by clergy, and specific prayers were common during prolonged rainy seasons. These acts served both spiritual and social functions. They provided psychological comfort, unified communities in times of stress, and maintained the rhythms of tradition that linked people to their land and history. The delicate balance of rainfall also highlights the precarity of agrarian life. Unlike today's agriculture, bolstered by technology and science, medieval farmers were vulnerable to the whims of nature. A single season of excessive rain or drought could mean famine, economic collapse, or forced migration. This uncertainty shaped not only farming practices, but also social structures, as communities developed systems of mutual aid and resilience to withstand environmental hardship. In a way, the prayer for no rain was a negotiation, a plea for moderation from a force both feared and revered. It reflected humanity's profound dependence on and respect for the natural world. The act of looking up and praying was a moment of humility, acknowledging that despite toil and skill, some outcomes remained beyond control. This ancient connection to weather teaches us about resilience and reverence. It reminds us that agriculture is not merely a technical endeavor, but a deeply human one, intertwined with belief, community, and the rhythms of the earth. The farmer's prayer for no rain is a testament to the enduring relationship between people and nature, a ritual born from necessity, hope, and an intimate understanding of life's fragile balance. In contemplating this, we grasp the profound vulnerability and strength of those who shaped civilization from the soil. Their prayers echo through history as silent testaments to the daily battles fought against uncertainty, a reminder that, before forecasts and technology, faith and observation were the farmer's most vital tools in the struggle to feed the world. The dream you couldn't tell to anyone. Dreams in early villages were not just fleeting images from sleep. They were potent messages from a world beyond, mysterious signals that could shape a person's fate and the fate of their community. To wake from a nightmare was to confront more than fear. It was to face a force that demanded attention, respect, and often silence. In these tightly knit societies, villagers believed dreams were omens, windows into the future, or reflections of hidden dangers. But some dreams were too dark, too unsettling, too dangerous to share openly, and so they became secrets, locked away behind wary eyes and trembling lips. The cultural weight of dreams in such communities was immense. Dreams could predict death, disease, or disaster. But they could also foretell blessings or divine favor. Yet nightmares, with their terrifying visions and inexplicable horrors, were especially feared. A nightmare was not merely a bad night's sleep. It was a warning or a curse, a signal that something malevolent or unfortunate was stirring in the unseen world. This fear transformed dreams into powerful, silent burdens. Villagers who woke with a nightmare often found themselves caught between two worlds, the waking life full of tangible realities, and the shadowy realm their dreams revealed. Speaking about these nightmares was fraught with risk. Sharing the dream could invite gossip, suspicion, or panic. Worse, it might attract the attention of evil spirits or misfortune to the dreamer or the whole village. For many, the safest path was silence, a guarded secrecy that protected not only themselves, but their families. Confession to the village priest was one of the few avenues for relief. Priests and spiritual leaders were seen as intermediaries who could interpret dreams, exorcise evil, or offer protective prayers. The priest's counsel was a mixture of comfort and authority, a way to translate the cryptic language of dreams into actionable guidance. Yet even this was a delicate process. To confess a nightmare was to admit vulnerability and fear, risking stigma or judgment. Historically, dream interpretation was deeply embedded in the spiritual and social fabric of early communities. Many cultures had rich traditions of reading dreams, assigning symbolic meaning to animals, colors, or events within them. But alongside interpretation came taboo and dread, especially when dreams portended death, betrayal, or supernatural wrath. The line between prophecy and paranoia was thin, and villagers walked it cautiously. The psychological impact of this fear was profound. Living under the shadow of ominous dreams could shape behavior, relationships, and mental health. Nightmares might cause anxiety or insomnia, while the pressure to remain silent intensified isolation. This collective tension underscored how dreams, though private, were public matters in a community where fate was shared and survival was communal. Moreover, this fear of dreams reflects a universal human desire to understand the unknown and exert control over uncertain forces. Dreams became a battleground where faith, superstition, and personal experience collided. The unspoken terror of the nightmare shaped not only individual lives, but the social dynamics of the village itself. Today, while many view nightmares as psychological phenomena, the echoes of past beliefs remind us of how deeply humans have always sought meaning in sleep's mysteries. The dream you couldn't tell anyone stands as a testament to the power of the unseen, the weight of silence, and the fragile boundary between fear and hope. In the quiet morning after a restless night, when eyes open heavy with unspoken terror, one can glimpse the ancient struggle to face a vision that haunts but cannot be voiced, to carry a secret omen alone. This is the dream that shaped lives, governed actions, and whispered in the shadows of history, forever marking the fragile line between waking and dreaming, fear and faith. The soot you wiped from your face. In the dim glow of a medieval hearth, where families gathered for warmth and light, sleep came wrapped in the flickering dance of flames and smoke. Without chimneys or modern ventilation, fires smoldered in the center of rooms or in open hearths, sending soot and ash curling through the air. To sleep near these vital flames was to embrace both comfort and discomfort, warmth and grime. When morning arrived, villagers awoke to faces marked by the blackened residue of the night, the soot that clung stubbornly to skin and hair, a daily reminder of the harsh realities of their environment. This soot was more than a superficial nuisance. It was an ever-present companion of medieval life. The smoke from fires, laden with tiny particles of burnt wood, peat, or coal, infiltrated living spaces relentlessly. Walls, ceilings, clothing, and bodies bore its mark. Sleeping close to the fire was essential for survival during cold nights, but it also meant inhaling smoky air and accumulating a layer of ash on exposed skin. The face, being the most exposed part of the body, showed this soot clearly in the morning light. Wiping soot from the face was a ritual of awakening and preparation. Villagers used rags, water, or even handfuls of straw to clear their cheeks and foreheads, striving to restore a semblance of cleanliness and readiness before stepping outside. This simple act was a transition, a shedding of the night's darkness and grime, and an embrace of the day's duties and social interactions. To appear soot-covered in public was not only unpleasant, but could be socially stigmatizing, signaling neglect or poverty. The presence of soot also had practical implications for health. Constant exposure to smoke increased risks of respiratory problems, eye irritation, and skin issues. Medieval medical texts recognize the dangers of smoke-filled environments, advising care where possible, though few alternatives existed. The soot on the face was a visible trace of these invisible hazards, a mark of the environment's toll on the body. Culturally, this soot became intertwined with daily rhythms and social identity. The morning cleansing ritual was communal and necessary, a shared experience among villagers that underscored their common struggle against the elements. It also reinforced social distinctions. Wealthier households might have better ventilated hearths, separate kitchens, or tools to minimize soot exposure, while the poor bore its marks more heavily. The soot also influenced appearance and clothing choices. Darkened faces might have been partially concealed by headscarves, hoods, or other garments, both for protection during sleep and modesty during the day. The pervasive presence of smoke and soot shaped not only hygiene, but aesthetics and self-presentation in medieval society. This daily encounter with soot highlights the intimate relationship between people and their environment in the pre-modern world. It reminds us that medieval life was lived in close proximity to elemental forces, fire for warmth and cooking, but also smoke for discomfort and health risk. The soot wiped from the face each morning was a tangible sign of this balance, a daily negotiation between survival and hardship. Through this lens, the simple act of cleaning soot becomes a powerful symbol of resilience and adaptation. It was a moment of renewal, a brief reclaiming of dignity amid conditions that were often harsh and unforgiving. It connected individuals to their community, their environment, and the rhythms of life that governed their days. So when you imagine the medieval morning, picture a village slowly stirring as faces emerge from the night's shadows, hands reaching up to wipe away the blackened ash, the soot that marked their nights of warmth and survival. This soot was more than dirt. It was the echo of fire's glow, the trace of a world where comfort came entwined with hardship. And every morning was a fresh start against the dark, the baby that didn't wake up. In the quiet dawn of countless villages long ago, the first fragile breath of a newborn was both a miracle and a precarious hope. Infant mortality in medieval and early modern societies was heartbreakingly high, a grim reality woven deeply into the fabric of daily life. Each morning, before any other concern, mothers would rise and check on their babies, sometimes with prayers whispered, sometimes with heavy silence, knowing that not every child would greet the new day alive. The presence of death among the youngest was a tragic, intimate experience that shaped families, communities, and the very rhythm of existence. The causes of such high infant mortality were many and intertwined. Lack of advanced medical knowledge meant that complications during pregnancy and birth were often fatal. Poor sanitation, malnutrition, and rampant infectious diseases made newborns vulnerable. Simple conditions that modern medicine easily treats, fever, dehydration, respiratory infections, could swiftly claim lives in the absence of effective remedies. Moreover, many babies were born premature or weak, with no hope of survival in harsh living conditions. The emotional weight on mothers was immense. The daily ritual of checking on a sleeping infant was charged with hope and fear. Waking to find a baby unresponsive was a silent, crushing sorrow. These mothers often bore their grief in solitude, as mourning a child was deeply painful and sometimes socially complicated. Yet the community shared this sorrow collectively. Infant death was widespread and often publicly mourned, even if quietly endured. The image of small, still bodies being carried away by grieving parents is haunting and speaks to the harshness of life in these times. Funerals for infants, though often brief and simple, held significant spiritual meaning. Religious rituals sought to secure the child's soul's safe passage and comfort the living. Communities recognized these losses as a shared burden, reinforcing social bonds amid the common tragedy. Infant mortality shaped family structures and social customs. Families might have several children, knowing that not all would survive to adulthood. Naming customs, baptismal practices, and even inheritance laws were influenced by these demographic realities. The constant presence of death among the youngest imparted a sobering acceptance alongside enduring hope, resilience, and deep love. Medical practices of the time, though limited, reveal efforts to save infants. Midwives, herbalists, and early physicians employed a variety of remedies, herbal infusions, prayers, charms, seeking to protect the vulnerable newborn. While their understanding was limited, these practices highlight the profound human desire to nurture and preserve life despite overwhelming odds. The psychological toll on families was significant, yet historical accounts suggest a community rhythm that accommodated grief within daily survival. The shared experience of loss fostered empathy and collective memory, with stories, prayers, and rituals passing through generations. This collective consciousness around infant mortality influenced cultural narratives about life, death, and the preciousness of each moment. Understanding the morning ritual of checking on babies in historical contexts reveals a poignant intersection of love, fear, and the relentless fragility of life. It invites us to honor the courage of mothers and families who faced such profound uncertainty every day, navigating joy and heartbreak in a world without the medical safety nets we have today. Today, as medical advances have dramatically reduced infant mortality in many parts of the world, it is important to remember the countless lives quietly lost throughout history. The morning glance at a sleeping baby was once a moment filled with vulnerability and silent prayer, a poignant reminder of the preciousness and precariousness of life. So imagine those early mornings when mothers looked upon their infants with trembling hope, sometimes to find silence where breath once was. The baby that didn't wake up is a somber emblem of humanity's enduring struggle with mortality, a testament to love's resilience in the face of unthinkable loss, and a call to remember the depth of history's intimate sorrows. The cloak you slept beneath all winter. In the chill of medieval winters, warmth was a precious commodity, and comfort was a scarce luxury. Unlike today's cozy homes equipped with central heating and thick blankets, the common folk faced biting cold nights in humble dwellings that offered little insulation against frost and dampness. For most peasants, blankets as we know them were rare or non-existent. Instead, they sought warmth beneath whatever materials were at hand, typically their cloaks, animal furs, or even layers of hay. Cloaks, often heavy woolen garments worn daily, doubled as night coverings. Their thick fabric provided some insulation, trapping body heat and shielding sleepers from drafts. These cloaks were more than clothing. They were vital tools for survival in harsh conditions. Furs, when available, were prized for their natural warmth and softness, though owning furs was a luxury beyond the reach of many peasants. Hay, abundant in rural settings, served as an unconventional but practical layer, either stuffed into mattresses or spread over beds to add insulation and cushioning. Sleeping beneath these materials, villagers often faced discomfort, not only from cold, but from the dampness that crept into their coverings. The very act of breathing in unheated, poorly ventilated huts could cause condensation to settle on cloaks and furs. Frost sometimes formed on surfaces overnight, so waking meant shaking off icy crystals or damp wool clinging stubbornly to skin and hair. This was not just an inconvenience, but a daily reminder of the relentless hardships of winter. The scarcity of proper bedding reflected the economic and technological realities of the time. Wool and linen textiles required considerable labor to produce, and weaving enough fabric for dedicated blankets was often unaffordable for peasants. Their homes were small and multifunctional, with limited space to store bulky bedding. Thus, using clothing as bedding was an efficient adaptation. Cloaks worn by day transformed into quilts by night. This practice also illustrates the blurring of boundaries between clothing and household items in medieval life. Objects had to be versatile, serving multiple functions in a world where material goods were scarce and precious. A cloak was a garment, a blanket, a shield against the elements, and a symbol of the wearer's status and identity. The experience of sleeping under such coverings shaped villagers' relationship with the seasons and their own bodies. Cold nights were endured with resilience and pragmatism, fueling a deep understanding of nature's cycles and human limitations. The morning chill, the dampness on skin, and the rough textures of wool or hay were intimate parts of life's rhythm. Yet, despite the hardships, these coverings provided crucial protection. They enabled villagers to survive winters that could be deadly, offering a fragile warmth that separated life from death. The cloak beneath which one slept was a silent guardian through long nights, absorbing sweat, holding heat, and offering comfort in a stark world. In waking, peasants often faced the challenge of preparing for the day while still dealing with remnants of the night's cold, shaking off frost, adjusting damp garments, and bracing against the morning chill. Their bodies were toughened by such repeated exposure, their spirits hardened by the necessity to endure. The cloak you slept beneath all winter thus becomes a potent symbol, a testament to human adaptation, endurance, and the quiet dignity found in daily survival. It reveals a world where warmth was scarce, comfort was earned, and every thread carried the story of lives intertwined with the harshness and beauty of the natural world. Through this lens, we see beyond the simple fabric to the resilience woven into medieval life, where even the coldest nights were met with resourcefulness, and where the humble cloak was more than a garment. It was a lifeline between the biting frost outside and the fragile flame of human warmth within.